On our 40th wedding anniversary, my husband stood in front of 70 people and told them I was losing my mind. And the part that stayed with me wasn't the words themselves. It was how easily they fit in his mouth, like he had been trying them out in private for days and had finally found the right room to say them out loud. We were in the fellowship hall behind the church, the one with the humming lights and the long tables that always smell faintly like coffee even when no one is drinking any. And there was a cake on a folding table to my left that was starting to lean just slightly because someone had set it too close to the vent, and I remember noticing that before I noticed anything else. The way the frosting on one side had softened and slipped a little, like it had given up trying to hold its shape. Before we continue, after you like and leave a comment, I hope something good finds you this week. Peace, clarity, or maybe just a quiet moment that's yours alone. Tell me, how old are you? And where are you listening from tonight? I always like to know who I'm sitting with when I tell these stories. Let's continue. Martin laughed after he said it, a soft, practiced laugh, and a few people laughed with him because that's what you do when a man makes a joke about his wife in a room where you've known them for years, and you don't want to be the one who turns it into something serious. He said I'd been forgetting things, misplacing things, getting confused, and he said it like he was explaining the weather, like it was something that had just happened on its own without anyone touching it. I was standing near the end of the table where Marissa had arranged the gift bags in a line that was just a little too straight to be casual. My hand resting on the back of a chair I didn't need, and I could feel the wood under my palm, worn smooth in the places where people always hold it. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something could feel so familiar and still not belong to you in that moment. Caleb was 2 steps behind Marissa, holding his phone in a way he thought looked natural, angled just enough to catch everything without making it obvious. And when our eyes met, he didn't look away. He just smiled a little, like he was waiting for a reaction he had already decided I was going to give him. Marissa moved before Martin finished speaking, already stepping in, already holding the folder, because this part wasn't an idea that had just come to them. It was something they had prepared, something they had practiced in smaller conversations that didn't include me. She said my name quietly, the way you say something when you want to sound gentle, and she placed the folder in front of me, opening it with both hands like she was presenting something important, something I should feel grateful for. "Mom, this is just to make things easier," she said. And there was a pen already clipped to the corner of the paper, the kind with a blue cap that leaves a mark you can't rub out once it's there. I looked at the page without really reading it at first, just taking in the weight of it, the thickness, the way it didn't bend easily when I touched the edge. And I saw my name printed neatly above a blank line that was waiting for me to turn it into something else. Caleb stepped closer, still holding the phone, and said, "It's nothing, Mom. It just helps us manage things." And I noticed the word us because it had been doing a lot of work in this family for a long time. Covering gaps, smoothing over differences, making things sound shared when they weren't. Martin had come down from the front of the room by then, standing just behind them, not saying anything, just watching. The way a man watches when he believes the outcome is already decided. I did not pick up the pen. I did not ask what it was. I let my fingers rest lightly on the edge of the paper, and I looked at it long enough for Marissa to think I was reading, long enough for Caleb to shift his weight slightly, adjusting his grip on the phone. And then I looked up at all 3 of them, at the way they had arranged themselves around me without quite touching me, like they were careful not to break something fragile, and I smiled. "I'll sign," I said, and I watched it move through them, that small release of breath people have when something goes the way they hoped it would. The drop in Marissa's shoulders, the quick glance Caleb gave to his screen, checking that he was still recording, the almost invisible nod Martin gave like he had expected nothing else. "After dinner," I added, and I slid the folder back toward her with 2 fingers, careful not to disturb the page, because I needed it exactly as it was for a little while longer. There's a kind of silence that sits underneath noise, and I could feel it there, even as people started talking again, even as someone somewhere laughed a little too loudly to fill the space that had opened up for a moment and then been covered again. I stepped back from the table and picked up my cup of coffee, which had gone lukewarm while Martin was speaking, and I took a sip anyway because I didn't want to stand there with empty hands, and it tasted like it had been sitting for a while, that slightly bitter edge you get when it's been on a warmer too long. My name is Eleanor Whitcomb. I am 68 years old, and I have spent most of my life being the person people don't worry about. It sounds like a compliment when someone says you're strong, when they say you've always handled things, when they say you'll be fine. But what it really means, most of the time, is that they have already decided not to look too closely at what you're carrying. I made wedding dresses for 30 years, the kind you don't rush, the kind where you sit with the fabric long enough to understand how it wants to fall before you cut into it. And I approach the rest of my life the same way, paying attention to the seams no one else ever sees. I still have my workroom at the back of the house, the one with the window that catches the light in the late afternoon at an angle that makes everything look softer than it is. And the floor has a slight dip near the door where the boards have settled over time. So if you walk in without thinking, your step changes just enough to remind you where you are. There's a table against the wall where I keep my patterns, a cabinet with drawers that stick in the winter and slide too easily in the summer, and a small metal box that used to belong to my mother, where I keep things that don't belong anywhere else. When I left 12 days before that dinner, I did what I always do when I go away. I wrote a list and left it on the counter, even though no one in that house has ever followed a list I've written, unless I stood there and read it out loud to them. I checked the back door twice. I turned off the lamp in the hallway that flickers if you leave it on too long. And I handed Martin the spare key to the workroom because he asked for it in a way that made it sound like a small thing, like something I would be unreasonable to refuse. Giving someone a key doesn't feel like a decision when you do it. It feels like something that has already been decided by years of habit, by the shape your life has taken around another person, by the belief that there are certain lines that don't need to be explained because they won't be crossed. I handed him the key and he took it without looking at me, already turning away to put it on his ring. And I remembered noticing that he had added a new keychain since the last time I'd paid attention, something with a small metal tag that caught the light when he moved. I drove to my sister's place that afternoon with 2 bags in the back seat and a stack of paper patterns I thought I might have time to work on, and the left turn signal made that soft clicking sound it always makes, a little slower than it should, like it's thinking about whether it wants to keep going. And I listened to it all the way down the road without turning on the radio, because I have never been good at filling silence with noise just to avoid hearing my own thoughts. The first time Martin called while I was away, he sounded normal, maybe a little distracted, the way he does when he's doing something else at the same time. And he asked how my sister was and whether I'd found the place all right. And I told him everything was fine because it was, at least at that moment, and because that's the answer people expect when they ask questions like that. The second time, he sounded quicker, like he was trying to finish the conversation before it had fully started, and he said, "Everything's under control here," without me asking. And I remember thinking that it was an odd thing to say about a house that had never required control in the first place. By the time I stood in that room on our anniversary, with the paper in front of me and the 3 of them waiting for me to do what they had already decided I would do, I understood something I hadn't quite put into words yet. It wasn't that something had suddenly gone wrong while I was away. It was that something had been moving in that direction for a long time, and I had been the one holding it in place without realizing how much pressure was building against it. I took another sip of the coffee, set the cup down, and rested my hand lightly on the edge of the table, feeling the slight give in the wood where it had been used too often for too many years. They thought they had chosen the moment carefully, that they had found the right room, the right audience, the right way to make something irreversible look simple. They were wrong about one thing. They thought I hadn't been paying attention. I paid for most of the life they were trying to take, and that is not something I ever said out loud. Not because I was trying to be generous or quiet or any of the words people use when they describe a woman who does the work without asking to be seen, but because I learned early that the moment you start listing what you've carried, someone will try to turn it into a conversation about what they've carried instead. It was easier to keep the numbers where they belonged, written down, contained, not open to revision. I used to keep everything in a shoebox under the sink, back when the bills came in thicker envelopes and the return addresses meant something before you opened them, and that box still smells faintly like lemon cleaner because I knocked a bottle over one afternoon and never quite got the scent out of the cardboard. I can still see the stain on the inside if I close my eyes, the way it spread unevenly along the bottom, soaking into the corners first. mortgage statements, insurance notices, electric bills with those little bar graphs on the side that tell you whether you've used more or less than the month before, as if that comparison changes anything about what you owe. I stacked them by month at first, neat and flat, and then by type when there were too many to keep from sliding every time I reached for something in the back. I stopped using the box when I realized it was easier to carry the record with me than to keep it in a place other people could reach without thinking about it. The notebook I use now fits in my purse without bending, the cover worn smooth along the edge where my thumb rests when I flip it open, and the first page has a date from 12 years ago, written in ink that pressed a little too hard into the paper, the imprint still visible on the next page if you look at it in the right light. I didn't start writing things down because I thought I would forget them. I started because I noticed that other people remembered things differently when it was convenient, and I wanted a version that didn't move. There's a way the pen sounds when it moves across paper late at night, a soft drag that's different from the sound it makes in the morning when your hand is steady and the light is better. And I hear that more often than I hear the television in this house. I write at the counter after the dishes are done, after the last cabinet door has been closed, and the house has settled into that kind of quiet that feels earned rather than given. Dates on the left, amounts on the right, a small mark in the margin when something doesn't come back the way it was supposed to. I don't decorate the pages. I don't underline anything. I don't need to. The numbers speak clearly enough on their own. Martin has never asked to see that notebook. He has asked questions that circle around it, questions about where things stand, or whether I've looked into something. But he has never asked for the record itself, and I think that's because he has always believed that the things I manage are separate from the things that matter. He prefers larger conversations, the kind you can have standing up, the kind that sound like decisions even when they are still just ideas. He sold cars for most of his life, and he learned that confidence can fill in the space where details should be, that if you keep talking, most people will follow you long enough not to notice what you skipped over. Caleb learned that language before he learned the numbers behind it. He has always had plans that arrived fully formed and then unraveled slowly at the edges. Ideas that depended on the next thing working out before the current one had been paid for. There was a year, not long after his first business closed, when he sat at this same table and explained a new venture that involved a warehouse and a line of furniture he had not yet sourced. And Martin nodded like the building already existed, like the orders had already been placed. I asked about rent, about insurance, about the cost of keeping something like that running in a month when nothing's sold. And I remember the way the room shifted slightly, the way questions can do that, pulling a conversation back to a place where it has to hold its own weight. I covered 3 payments for him that year, each one written down with the date and the amount, and a small space left beside it where a return might go. I did not ask for it back. I did not remind him. I simply left the space there, empty, because I have learned that an empty space can tell you more about a person than a filled one if you give it enough time. Marissa works differently. She does not push, she suggests. She frames things in a way that makes refusal feel like a kind of failure, as if saying no is not about the request itself, but about what that refusal says about you as a person. She has asked me to fix more dresses than I can count, small alterations before showings, hems adjusted the night before a client meeting, the kind of work that disappears once it's done. She thanks me every time, always, and she means it in that moment, I think. But gratitude that depends on repetition starts to feel less like appreciation and more like a rhythm you fall into, without noticing how much it costs to keep it going. The house has its own memory, separate from all of us. The third step on the staircase creaks in the same place it did 10 years ago. A small shift in the wood that I never corrected because it told me where I was in the dark without needing to turn on a light. The cabinet by the sink sticks in the winter and opens too easily in the summer, the hinge loosening just enough with the change in temperature to remind you that nothing in this place stays exactly the same, even when it looks like it does. The kitchen window catches the light in the late afternoon and throws it across the counter at an angle that makes the surface look warmer than it feels. And if you stand there long enough, you can watch it move, inch by inch, until it's gone. In the weeks before I left to stay with my sister, there were small changes that didn't fit into that rhythm. Conversations that paused when I entered the room, not abruptly, not enough to call attention to themselves, but just long enough to suggest that something had been adjusted to accommodate my presence. Martin asked one evening, while I was rinsing a plate that didn't need rinsing anymore, whether I had ever considered consolidating my accounts, simplifying things, he said, as if complexity were the problem rather than the only reason anything still lined up the way it did. I turned off the faucet before I answered him because I wanted to hear the question without anything else layered over it. They are already simple, I said, and he shrugged, not disagreeing, not agreeing, just moving the conversation along to something else the way he always does when he has gathered what he needed. Marissa called the next day and asked how I kept track of everything, whether I used one account or several, whether I had anything set up in case something happened. I stood in the workroom while she spoke, looking at the pattern laid out on the table, the chalk lines marking where the fabric would be cut, and I answered her in the same way I always have, with enough information to satisfy the question, but not enough to change what I knew she was trying to understand. Caleb texted me later that week, asking for the passcode to the laptop I keep in the workroom because his phone wasn't working properly, and I told him I would look up whatever he needed, and he didn't respond after that. None of these things, on their own, would have been enough to mean anything. Together, they formed a pattern that I had seen before in smaller ways, a gathering of details that pointed in the same direction even if no one said it out loud. The night before I left, I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open, the overhead light giving off that slightly dull glow it has when it's close to burning out, and I went through the accounts line by line, not because I expected to find something wrong, but because I have learned that the act of checking is often what keeps things from becoming wrong in the first place. There are 3 accounts in my name that Martin does not know in full, not because I hid them deliberately at the start, but because he never asked in a way that suggested he wanted to understand them beyond the surface. And over time, that absence of curiosity became its own kind of protection. One of those accounts holds the savings from my work, the accumulation of hours that no one else in that house has tracked because they were never there to see them all at once. Another is tied to a trust my mother set up before she passed. Something she explained to me at her own kitchen table, her finger resting on the page as she pointed to the parts that mattered. The conditions, the signatures required, the way it was structured so that it could not be accessed by anyone who did not follow the process exactly. People don't always take what they can't reach, she said that day. They take what looks close enough. I did not repeat that to Martin when he asked about simplifying things. I did not explain it to Marissa when she asked about structure. I did not mention it to Caleb when he asked for access. There is a point where explaining becomes a way of giving someone a map, and I had already begun to see that not everyone needed one. When I closed the notebook that night, I pressed my hand flat against the page for a moment before sliding it back into my purse, feeling the slight indentation of the pen marks beneath my palm, the record of what had already been decided even if no one else had acknowledged it yet. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after everything that needs to be done has been done, and I stood there longer than necessary, listening to it, noticing how it held together in that moment without any visible strain. By the time I stood in that hall on our anniversary, with the paper in front of me and the pen still clipped neatly to the corner, I understood the difference between what they thought they were taking and what they were actually reaching for. They believed they were taking from me. They were reaching into something that had already been written down, line by line, in a way they did not know existed. They thought I was just careful, and for a long time I let them think that because careful is one of those words people use when they don't want to admit they are being watched by someone quieter than they are. Careful sounds harmless. Careful sounds like labeled envelopes and locked doors and checking the oven twice before leaving the house. It does not sound like preparation. It does not sound like a woman sitting at her kitchen table at 11:37 at night with a half-cold cup of tea beside her and a notebook open under a weak yellow light, realizing that the people she has fed, covered, rescued, and forgiven are beginning to ask questions that point toward the same locked drawer. The first time I knew something had shifted was not when Martin asked about my accounts, and it was not when Marissa called with that soft professional voice she uses when she wants a favor to sound like concern. It was smaller than that. It was the silver key on Martin's ring. He has carried the same key ring for years, a heavy old thing with too many keys on it, keys to cars we no longer owned, a key to his old office that had been closed for 6 years, a tiny brass bottle opener he got from a dealership Christmas party in 2004 and never used. I know the sound of it when he sets it down on the hall table. I know the exact dull clatter it makes against the little ceramic dish by the front door, the one with a blue crack through the middle that Caleb made in 5th grade, and that I kept because mothers keep strange things when they are still trying to believe everything can be repaired. That week, the ring sounded heavier. It is a ridiculous thing to notice, unless you are the one who notices everything. He came in from the garage one evening and dropped the keys into the dish, and the sound was wrong, just slightly wrong, a sharper note underneath the usual clatter. I was standing at the stove stirring soup that had too much pepper in it because I had been distracted, and I looked over without turning my head fully, the way you look at something when you do not want the person beside you to know you are looking. There was a new key on the ring. Silver, fresh cut. The edges still too clean. "What's that one for?" I asked. Martin looked down, as if he had forgotten it was there, which told me he had not forgotten at all. "Garage cabinet," he said. "Old one sticks." The old one did not stick. I knew because I had opened that cabinet 3 days earlier to get the extension cord for the lamp in the workroom, the one that flickers when the air gets damp. I did not say that. I stirred the soup once more, slower than I needed to, and said, "All right." There are arguments you lose by starting them too early. I have learned that the hard way. If you ask too soon, people become careful. They hide better. They rehearse. They start calling your questions paranoia before you have collected enough facts to call their answers lies. So I let the key sit there on the ring. I let Martin believe his explanation had landed. I served the soup in the green bowls with the small chips along the rim, and Caleb came by later that night without calling first, which he had started doing again after 3 months of remembering how doorbells work. He brought Sophie with him, his daughter, 17 and too observant for the house she was growing up in. She sat at the counter with her math homework open and one earbud in, pretending not to listen the way teenagers do when they are listening to every word. Caleb asked about my laptop while Martin was in the living room pretending to watch the news and really watching the doorway between rooms. "My phone's acting up," Caleb said. "I just need to look something up real quick." "What do you need?" I asked. He tapped his fingers on the counter, the same rhythm he used when he was 12 and waiting to tell me he had broken something. "It's nothing. I can do it." "I can look it up." He gave a little laugh, not enough to be rude if I called it rude, but enough to tell me he was annoyed. "Mom, it's just a laptop." And there it was, just. The most dangerous word in a family like mine. Just a key, just a signature, just a favor, just a few dollars until Friday. Just help your brother, your daughter, your husband, your son. Just be reasonable. Just don't make this harder than it has to be. Sophie looked up then, only for a second, and her eyes went from Caleb to me and then down to her worksheet again. She did not say anything. I did not either. I told Caleb I would look up whatever he needed once I finished cleaning the kitchen. He said never mind. He left 20 minutes later with Sophie trailing behind him, her backpack half open and one paper slipping out of the side pocket. I picked it up before she noticed. It was a permission slip for a school trip, folded twice, signed by Caleb in a hurry. His signature leaned hard to the right, angry almost, like it was trying to get away from the page. I remember that because signatures matter. People think signatures are just names. They are not. They are habits. They are muscle memory. They are the body telling the truth even when the mouth has learned not to. The next morning, after Martin left to meet someone for breakfast, though he had stopped saying who, I went into my workroom and stood in the doorway for a while before touching anything. The room smelled like cotton, chalk dust, and the faint lavender sachet I keep in the top drawer because my mother used to do that with linens, and I copied her before I understood why. The late morning light was coming through the window in a narrow strip across the cutting table, lighting up the little threads that always seem to appear no matter how many times I sweep. Everything looked normal at first, the pattern weights in their tin, the pincushion by the machine, the old wooden chair with one leg that needs a folded piece of cardboard under it so it does not rock. Then I saw the drawer, not open, not even obviously moved, just not closed all the way. The third drawer in the cabinet, where I keep older papers no one has asked about in years, stuck out less than half an inch. Most people would not have noticed. Most people do not live with a drawer that has to be lifted slightly before it slides in clean. I do. I pulled it open and looked inside. Nothing was missing at first glance. That was the thing that made my stomach tighten. People who steal in a hurry leave emptiness. People who search leave disorder. People who know they might need to come back leave things almost exactly as they were. I took out the folder with the trust documents and held it under the light. The papers were still there, but the top page sat crooked, and the crease near the staple had been flattened by a thumb that was not mine. I know that sounds small. It is small. But some betrayals enter a room quietly first. They try the doorknob before they kick it in. That afternoon, I called a man named Mr. Whitaker from the security shop on Willow Street. He had installed the camera over our back door after someone stole packages from 3 houses on our block the winter before. And he was the kind of man who spoke slowly because he believed every sentence should be assembled properly before it left his mouth. I told him I needed a small camera for my workroom, something discreet, nothing dramatic. "Trouble with deliveries again?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. He came the next day while Martin was out. The camera was smaller than I expected, no larger than the square of a postage stamp, tucked near the shelf above the cutting table where I keep old thread spools in a glass jar. It faced the cabinet, the door, and enough of the room to tell me who entered and what they touched. Mr. Whitaker showed me how the app worked, how the footage saved automatically, how motion alerts would come through even if I was not home. He asked if I wanted the receipt emailed or printed. "Both," I said. He smiled at that. "You're organized." "No," I said. "I've been married a long time." He did not laugh, but his face changed slightly, the way a person's face changes when they understand more than you meant to say. That night, I moved the most important papers. Not all of them. That would have been too obvious. I left copies where they expected originals to be, and I put the originals in a canvas sewing bag with a broken zipper that had been sitting in the back of the hall closet for 8 years. No one in my family notices broken things unless they need someone else to fix them. I put the trust documents there, the account summaries, the insurance paperwork, and one old photograph of my mother standing in front of her kitchen stove with a wooden spoon in her hand, looking directly at the camera like she already knew the future would require witnesses. Then I called the bank. Not to accuse anyone. Not yet. I only added a second verification step to the trust account and changed the alert settings so every attempted access, every balance inquiry, every failed password would come to my phone and my email. The woman on the line asked if I wanted to add a trusted contact. I looked across the kitchen at Martin's jacket hanging over the back of a chair, the pockets sagging slightly with whatever he had stuffed into them instead of putting away. "No," I said. "Remove the one listed." There was a pause. Keyboard sounds. "Your husband?" "Yes." Another pause. "All right, Mrs. Whitcomb, that change is complete." I thanked her and hung up, and for a moment I just sat there with the phone in my hand, listening to the refrigerator hum and the little click it makes before the motor settles. It should have felt dramatic, removing your husband from something after 40 years. It did not. It felt like locking a door you had only just realized had been standing open. When I left for June's house 2 days later, I did not take the notebook with me in my suitcase. I kept it in my purse, where it belonged. I handed Martin the spare key to the workroom because he had asked for it, because refusing would have told him too much, because sometimes the only way to learn what someone intends to do with a key is to give it to them and watch which door they open. He kissed my cheek when I left. His mouth was dry. He smelled like the aftershave he only used when he wanted people to think he had made an effort. "Don't worry about anything here," he said. I looked at the house behind him, at the front window with the curtains slightly crooked, at the porch mat that still held the pale outline of where a flower pot had sat all summer before Caleb borrowed it and never brought it back. "I won't," I said. And that was the first true thing either of us had said all morning. On the third night I was away, the alert came in at 2:14 a.m., a small vibration against the nightstand that I almost ignored because I had finally fallen asleep after listening to my sister's breathing settle into something even and predictable from the other room. The kind of rhythm that tells you the body is doing what it's supposed to do without asking for help. I reached for the phone without opening my eyes all the way, the screen too bright at first, and for a moment I thought it was one of those automatic notifications that doesn't mean anything until you read it twice. But then I saw the app name at the top and the word motion underneath it, and I was awake in the way you become awake when something you prepared for actually begins. The camera in the workroom had triggered. I did not sit up right away. I have learned that urgency is not the same thing as speed, and if you move too quickly at the beginning of something like this, you miss the parts that matter later. I adjusted the pillow behind my back, turned the brightness down on the screen, and opened the feed with my thumb resting lightly on the edge so I wouldn't drop the phone if my hand decided to do something else. The room appeared in black and white, grainy at the edges the way night footage always is. The shapes softened just enough to make everything look less solid than it is. The cabinet was in frame, the door, the cutting table with the jar of thread catching a little of the light from the street lamp outside. For a second, nothing moved, and then the door opened. Martin stepped in first. He did not turn on the light. He stood there for a moment, just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust, and I could see the outline of his shoulders, the way he holds himself when he thinks no one is watching, slightly forward, as if he is already leaning into whatever comes next. Caleb followed him, closing the door behind them with more care than I have ever seen him use in that room, his hand staying on the handle for a second longer than necessary, as if he were making sure it would not make a sound after it had already been closed. They did not speak right away. That was the part that told me everything I needed to know. People who believe they are doing something harmless talk through it. They fill the space with explanations, with jokes, with little reassurances that they are not really doing anything wrong. Silence means planning. Silence means agreement reached earlier. Silence means there is nothing left to discuss because the decision has already been made. Caleb moved toward the cabinet, his steps slower than usual, measured in a way that would have looked careful if I did not know him well enough to recognize when he was trying not to be careless. He pulled the drawer open without lifting it first, and it stuck for a fraction of a second before giving way with that small resistance I have felt 100 times, and he paused, just briefly, as if surprised by it, as if objects in that room were not supposed to have their own rules. "Which one?" he said finally, his voice low, the words flattened so they would not carry. "Third," Martin answered, just as low, just as controlled. Caleb nodded once, a movement so small it barely registered on the screen, and reached into the drawer. He pulled out the folder I had left there, the one with the copies, not the originals, the one that looked exactly like the thing they thought they needed. He set it on the table and opened it, flipping through the pages faster than someone who was reading, slower than someone who already knew what they were looking for. "This it?" he asked. Martin stepped closer, leaning over his shoulder, and I could see his hand come into frame, pointing to the top page, to the signature line that had been empty when I left it. "That's it," he said. There was a pause then, a longer one, the kind that stretches just enough for doubt to have a place to sit if it's going to show up at all. It didn't. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a pen, not the one from the folder, his own. He held it in his hand for a second, turning it slightly, the way you do when you are about to write something that matters more than the space it takes up on the page. I watched his fingers settle into a grip I recognized, the same grip he used when he signed that permission slip for Sophie, the same slight pressure at the base of the thumb, the same angle that would push the letters forward before they had time to settle. "You sure?" he said. Martin did not hesitate. "We're not waiting any longer." And that was the moment. Not the pen touching the paper, not the line forming under his hand. The sentence before it. The decision made out loud, even if it was barely above a whisper. Caleb bent over the page and began to write my name. I watched it happen in real time, in that soft gray light, the way the first letter leaned too far to the right, the way the rest followed it without correction, the signature forming in a shape that looked like mine if you did not know how mine actually moved across a page. He finished it quickly, faster than I would have, because he was not thinking about how it should feel, only about how it should look. He lifted the pen, and for a second, his hand hovered above the paper, as if he were considering something else, another line, another mark. But then he set the pen down and stepped back. "That's enough," Martin said. Caleb closed the folder, not carefully, not sloppily, just enough to return it to something that looked undisturbed if you were not paying attention. He slid it back into the drawer, pushing it in without lifting, and this time it caught harder, the misalignment more obvious, and he forced it the rest of the way with the heel of his hand. They stood there for a moment longer. Martin looked around the room, not at anything in particular, just a sweep of the space, the table, the machine, the shelves, as if he were confirming something he had already decided was true. Caleb shifted his weight, his shoulders loosening slightly, the tension that had been there when he entered the room beginning to leave now that the act itself was done. "We'll handle the rest tomorrow," Martin said. Caleb nodded. Marissa already talked to someone. Of course she had. They turned off nothing, touched nothing else, and left the room the way they entered it, quietly, deliberately, carrying nothing with them that would suggest they had taken anything at all. The door closed. The screen went still again. I did not move for a long time after that. The phone was still in my hand, the image of the empty room held in place as if it might change if I looked away too quickly. There is a point where something you suspected becomes something you have seen, and the difference between those two things is not as large as people think, but it is permanent in a way suspicion is not. I set the phone down on the nightstand and leaned back against the headboard, listening to the quiet in my sister's house. The distant sound of a car passing on the road outside, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway that runs a little fast and has for years. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything else. I reached for the notebook in my bag and opened it to a blank page. Date, time, 2:14 a.m. I wrote what I had seen, not in full sentences, not in a way that would make sense to anyone else, but in the shorthand I have used for years, the kind that captures enough to be exact without needing to explain itself. Drawer, 3rd, Caleb. Signature, Martin present, no light. I paused for a moment, pen hovering over the page. And then I added one more line beneath it. Witness, recorded. I closed the notebook and placed it back in my bag, the zipper catching slightly at the corner the way it always does if you pull it too fast. I slowed my hand, eased it the rest of the way closed, and set it beside the bed. Sleep did not come back after that, but I did not need it to. Because by the time they thought they had taken the first real step, they had already given me everything I was going to need. They believed they had moved without being seen. They had just written the beginning of something I had already finished. I did not drive home early after watching Caleb sign my name, and that may sound strange unless you understand the difference between wanting to stop something and needing to know who else is standing inside it. I sat in my sister's spare bedroom with the phone face down on the quilt, the notebook zipped back inside my purse, and the morning light coming through the thin curtains in a tired gray strip, and I made myself wait. That was the hardest part. Not the watching, not the writing, the waiting. My sister June has always been better at noticing feelings than facts, which is one reason I have trusted her with both. She came into the kitchen that morning wearing a robe with one sleeve hanging lower than the other because she had slept poorly after surgery, and she looked at my face for less than 2 seconds before saying, "What did Martin do?" Not what happened, not "Are you all right?" What did Martin do? There are people who love you enough to skip the polite part. I was sitting at her small kitchen table, the one with the faded rooster tile in the middle that she has hated for 15 years and never replaced, holding a piece of toast I had not bitten into. The butter had gone cold on top of it, leaving pale streaks where it had stopped melting. I told her only enough. Motion alert, workroom, Martin and Caleb, a signature that was not mine. June lowered herself into the chair across from me very slowly, one hand pressed against her side. She had the tired, careful movements of someone whose body had recently reminded her it was not a machine, but her eyes were wide awake. "You call the police?" "No." She blinked. "Eleanor." "Not yet." She looked at me the way people look at a kettle that has been left on too long, waiting to see if it will whistle or explode. "Why not?" "Because Caleb said Marissa had talked to someone." June was quiet then, and I watched the sentence reach her. That is the thing about truth when it is shaped correctly. You do not have to raise your voice, you just have to put it where the other person can see it. By noon, Martin called me. I let it ring 3 times because I wanted to see whether he would hang up before the 4th, which he did not. That mattered in a small way. Men who feel guilty sometimes stop before the evidence begins. Men who feel entitled wait for you to answer.
"How's June?" he asked.
"She's tired."
"Recovery takes time."
He said that like a man who had read the sentence on a pamphlet and decided it would be useful. There was a rustling sound in the background, paper maybe, or a hand moving over a desk. I pictured him in the kitchen at our house, standing too close to the counter, the folder open somewhere near his elbow. I pictured Caleb beside him, shifting from one foot to the other. I pictured Marissa on speakerphone, not there physically, but present in the way she always was when something needed to sound cleaner than it was. "You coming back Sunday?" Martin asked. That was the plan. There was the smallest pause, not long enough to accuse, long enough to record inside myself. "No rush," he said. "Take care of your sister." No rush. I almost smiled at that. The night before, he had stood in my workroom and said they were not waiting any longer. By lunch, he wanted me to take my time. People who lie often forget the shape of their own urgency. After we hung up, I opened the bank app. No movement yet. No failed login. No alert. That told me the papers had not been submitted, or if they had not reached the point where the account pushed back. I did not know which, and not knowing is a hard place to sit when you are the kind of woman who has kept her life in order by knowing exactly where things are. But I sat there anyway. If you've ever been in a room where people spoke about your life like you weren't even there, you'll understand why I didn't react right away. Sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's timing. Stay with me, because this is where everything begins to turn, and nothing they planned is going to go the way they think. And if this kind of story speaks to you, you're always welcome to stay here with us. I drove home 2 days later, not because Martin wanted me to, and not because June was ready for me to leave, but because the next alert came at 9:06 on a Friday morning. Not from the camera, from the bank. Attempted access. That was all the message said at first, clean and cold, like banks have learned to make panic look professional. I was standing in June's bathroom, holding a folded towel when it came through, and I remember the towel because it was one of those old ones that had gone stiff from too many washes, the kind you keep using because it is not technically ruined. I set it down on the edge of the sink and read the message again. Attempted access to protected account, verification required. I did not call Martin. I called Tessa Grant at the bank. Tessa was not my usual representative, but she had helped me 3 years earlier when a check from a bridal client cleared twice by mistake, and I remembered her because she had apologized for the inconvenience before I had even explained it, which is rare in a bank and almost suspicious in a person. She answered on the second transfer, her voice careful, already professional. "Mrs. Whitcomb, I'm glad you called. We have a document here that requires verification." "What kind of document?" A pause. I heard keys clicking. "A power of attorney form authorizing account management." "Who submitted it?" Another pause, longer this time. "It came through a business fax line." "Name?" "I'm not comfortable releasing details until we verify." "Tessa," I said, and I heard my own voice then, steady but not soft. "The document is fraudulent. My son forged my signature while my husband watched. I have video." Silence on the line. Not empty silence, the kind where someone sits up straighter. "All right," she said. "Then I need you to come in today if possible." I'm on my way. The drive home took 2 hours and 40 minutes. I know because I watched every number on the dashboard as if the car itself were part of the record. The gas tank was just under half when I left June's. The tire pressure light flickered once and then disappeared, and there was a smear on the windshield I kept noticing every time the sun hit it. A curved mark left by a wiper blade that needed replacing. I did not turn on music. I did not call anyone. I let the road make its own noise. At the bank, Tessa met me in a small glass office that looked out onto the lobby, where a man in a baseball cap was arguing softly with a teller about a fee, and a child in pink shoes was spinning in place near the deposit slips while her mother pretended not to be embarrassed. Ordinary things kept happening around me, and that has always been one of the cruelest parts of a crisis. Your life shifts, and someone else is still choosing checking or savings. Tessa had the document printed on the desk when I sat down. She did not slide it toward me right away. That told me she had already seen enough to be careful. "The signature raised a flag," she said. I looked at it. My name was there, Eleanor Whitcomb. Or something trying to be. The E was wrong first, too narrow. Mine opens wider, not because I make it pretty, but because I learned cursive from a teacher who slapped the desk with a ruler when letters collapsed into each other, and some habits survive longer than the people who taught them. The W was too sharp. The line underneath was missing entirely. "That isn't mine," I said. I didn't think it was. "Where did it come from?" Tessa turned the page. "The fax header belongs to Whitcomb Family Holdings." I felt something in me go very still. "Say that again." She read it more slowly, as if saying it slower would make it less ugly. "Whitcomb Family Holdings, LLC." I had never heard the name before, but I knew immediately why it existed. Family. A word people use when they want theft to sound warmer. Holdings. A word people use when they want stolen things to sound organized. And who is listed? Tessa's mouth tightened. The document references Martin Whitcomb as managing member. Of course it did. "And Marissa?" I asked. Tessa looked down once, then back up. "The fax cover sheet lists Marissa Whitcomb Realty Group." There it was, not suspicion, not instinct, not a drawer sitting half an inch open in the dark. A paper trail. I placed my hands flat on my lap so Tessa would not see them curl. Not from fear, from the old urge to fix something before anyone else saw how badly it had broken. "They're trying to take control of the trust," I said. Tessa nodded once. They tried. That word mattered. Tried. I looked through the glass wall into the lobby, at the child in pink shoes now sitting on the floor, at the man in the baseball cap signing something angrily, at the teller smoothing a stack of bills against the counter, like paper could be made obedient if pressed firmly enough. Then I looked back at the forged form. For the first time since the camera alert, I felt something almost like relief, not because they had failed, because now they had put it in writing. I did not go straight home from the bank, and that may sound like hesitation if you have never had to decide whether you are going to confront something or build it into a case. But those are not the same decision, and confusing them is how people lose control of a situation that could have been managed if they had given it one more hour of thought. I sat in my car in the parking lot with the engine off and the key still in the ignition, listening to the faint ticking sound it makes as it cools down, and I looked at my hands, resting on the steering wheel, the small lines across my knuckles that have deepened over the years without me noticing exactly when. The forged document was in my bag, folded once by Tessa when she handed it to me, not because it needed to be folded, but because that is what people do when they pass you something that carries weight. They make it smaller, as if that helps. The paper had a slight warmth to it still from the printer, and I could feel it through the lining of the bag when I moved it with my foot on the passenger side. A physical reminder that what I had just seen was not something imagined or exaggerated by a tired mind. It existed. It had been printed. It had been sent somewhere with the expectation that it would be accepted. I thought about going to the police then. I thought about walking into the station 2 blocks over and placing the paper on a counter and saying, "This is my son's handwriting and my husband's idea," and letting someone else decide what happened next. It would have been simpler in one way, cleaner, the kind of action people understand when they hear it later. But simple is not always correct, and I have spent too many years fixing things after they were done simply to believe that the first obvious step is always the right one. Instead, I drove to a place I had not been in almost 8 years. The office sat at the end of a narrow street behind a row of older brick buildings that had been painted over so many times the corners no longer held a single color. The sign on the door read, Harlan and Company in gold letters that had begun to peel at the edges, and the glass reflected my face back at me in a way that made me look more tired than I felt. I stayed in the car for a minute longer than necessary, watching a man across the street carry a box of files into another office, the cardboard bending slightly under the weight as he adjusted his grip halfway to the door. I had met David Harlan once, years ago, when a client's dress contract had turned into something it was never meant to be, a dispute over payment that had nothing to do with lace or stitching, and everything to do with people deciding that signed agreements are optional if they feel inconvenient enough. He had handled it without raising his voice, without making it into something theatrical. And I remember noticing that he read every line of every document before he spoke, his finger resting lightly under each paragraph as if the paper might try to move if he did not keep it still. The door opened with a small bell that did not ring so much as click, and the office smelled faintly like paper and something older. Maybe the leather of the chairs or the polish used on the wood shelves that line the walls. A woman at the front desk looked up, her glasses sliding slightly down her nose, and asked if she could help me. "I need to speak with Mr. Harlan," I said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." She hesitated, the kind of pause that measures whether a person is worth interrupting someone for, and then she looked at something in my face that must have answered her question, because she picked up the phone and spoke quietly into it. "He can see you for a few minutes," she said, standing up and gesturing toward a door at the end of the hallway. David Harlan had more gray in his hair than I remembered, and his office was smaller than I expected, the desk pushed close to the window to make room for a second chair that had been repaired at least once along the seam of the armrest. He stood when I entered, not out of habit, I think, but because he recognized something in the way I held the bag at my side. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, and I was surprised he remembered my name. "You handled a contract dispute for me," I said, "a long time ago." "I remember," he said. "You read your own contracts." "That's why I'm here." I took the paper from my bag and placed it on his desk without unfolding it. He did that himself, slowly, smoothing the crease with the side of his hand, and he read it the way I remembered, line by line, his finger following the text without touching it directly. He did not interrupt me when I spoke. He did not ask questions until I had finished. "My son signed that," I said. "My husband was present. My daughter-in-law sent it." He nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that he had heard the structure of what I was telling him. "And you have proof?" he said. "Yes." "Video?" "Yes." He leaned back slightly in his chair, not far, just enough to create space between himself and the paper. "And they attempted to use this to access a protected account?" "Yes." "Was the access successful?" "No." Another small nod. He folded his hands once, then unfolded them, as if deciding where to place them. "All right," he said. "We're not going to call this a misunderstanding." "No," I said, "we're not." He allowed himself a brief, almost invisible smile at that, not because the situation was amusing, but because clarity is rare and he recognized it when it appeared. "There are a few ways to proceed," he said. "The most direct would be to file a report for forgery and attempted financial fraud. That starts a process that you do not control once it begins." "I know." "The other option," he continued, "is to document everything, secure the assets, and decide when and how to present what you have in a way that limits their ability to adjust their story." I looked at the paper again, at the signature that tried to be mine and failed in the places that mattered. "I want them to finish," I said. That was the first time he paused. "Finish?" he repeated. "I want to see how far they go when they think it's working." He studied me then, not the paper, not the lines, but my face, the way people do when they are deciding whether what you are asking for is something they can support or something they need to warn you away from. "That requires patience," he said. "I have that. It also requires that you don't intervene too early." "I won't." "And that you are comfortable with the risk that comes with letting someone continue an action you know is wrong." I thought about the camera footage, the quiet in the room, the way Caleb's hand had moved across the page, the way Martin had said they were not waiting any longer. "I am not comfortable," I said. "I am prepared." That seemed to be enough. He reached for a folder on his desk and opened it, sliding a blank sheet of paper toward himself. "Then we start with documentation," he said. "Every interaction, every attempt, every communication, we build a record that doesn't rely on memory." "I already have one," I said. He looked up again, that same small shift in his expression. "I thought you might," he said. I left his office with a list that was not written down, but had already arranged itself in my mind, a sequence of actions that did not require urgency to be effective. Secure accounts, duplicate records, maintain routine, do not confront, do not accuse, let them move. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the way it always had. The porch light still slightly crooked, the mat still worn at the edges, the window curtain not quite straight. There is something almost insulting about how ordinary a place can look when something inside it has changed completely. Martin's car was in the garage. Caleb's was not. I sat in the car for a moment, my hand resting on the door handle, feeling the slight give in the plastic where it has worn down over time. Then I opened it and stepped out, closing the door with more care than I usually would, the sound softer, less final. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and something reheated, the faint sweetness of something that had been microwaved too long. Martin was at the kitchen counter, a mug in his hand, his jacket draped over the back of the chair, the way it always is when he is trying to look like he has not just come in.
You're back early,
he said. I told you Sunday, I said. He nodded, as if that had been his expectation all along.
How's June?
She'll be fine. He took a sip of his coffee and set the mug down, leaving a small ring on the counter that he did not wipe away.
We should talk tonight,
he said.
About some things.
After dinner, I said. There was that pause again, small, measurable. After dinner, he agreed. I moved past him into the hallway, my hand brushing lightly against the wall where the paint has worn thin near the light switch, and I went into the workroom without turning on the overhead light. The camera was still there, quiet, watching. The drawer sat closed, the slight misalignment still visible if you knew where to look. I opened it, lifted it slightly the way it needed to be lifted, and pulled out the folder. The pages inside were exactly as they had left them, the forged signature resting where Caleb had placed it. The ink settled into the paper as if it had always belonged there. I closed the drawer carefully, adjusting it until it sat flush, the edge even with the cabinet, no gap, no sign that anything had been disturbed. Then I stood in the middle of the room for a moment, listening to the house, to the small sounds that have always been there and will always be there as long as the structure holds. They thought they had taken the first step. They didn't understand that I was the one deciding how far the path would go. By the time Marissa called me, I had already seen her name on the fax cover sheet, and that does something particular to a mother's body, seeing your child's name attached to a thing she will later pretend she did not understand. It is not surprise exactly. Surprise is cleaner than that. It arrives quickly and leaves room for the next feeling. This was slower. This was the kind of knowing that settles in your chest without asking permission, the kind that makes ordinary sounds feel too loud for a while. The phone rang at 5:42 while I was standing at the kitchen sink washing a glass Martin had left there with half an inch of coffee in the bottom, cold and dark, with that thin, oily circle floating on top that coffee gets when it has been abandoned too long. I remember the glass because it was one of the good ones. The heavy-bottomed set my sister gave us for Christmas years ago after Martin complained that our old glasses looked cheap. He had broken 2 of them within the first month and blamed the dishwasher. I had washed the remaining 4 by hand ever since, not because they mattered that much, but because after enough years you start protecting things even from people who should know how to hold them. Marissa's name lit up the screen, and I let it ring long enough to dry my hands on the towel hanging from the oven door, the one with the faded blue stripes and a corner that never lies flat, no matter how many times I fold it correctly. I answered on the 4th ring. "Mom," she said, warm at first, careful. "Are you home?" "Yes." I thought maybe I'd come by. There was no maybe in her voice. Marissa has always used soft words to cover hard intentions, the way people lay a tablecloth over a scratched table and expect you to stop knowing what's underneath. "For what?" I asked. A pause, not long, long enough. "I just think we should talk before Sunday." Sunday, our anniversary dinner. The one Martin had been building like a stage, not a celebration. The one where he wanted me in front of witnesses, smiling under bad church lighting while he handed me a pen and turned 40 years of marriage into a document. "All right," I said. She arrived 23 minutes later, which told me she had already been close by when she called. That was another thing I wrote down later. People reveal themselves in timing more often than in words. She parked at the curb instead of the driveway, even though there was space, and I watched her from the kitchen window as she checked her reflection in the rearview mirror before getting out. She smoothed the front of her blouse, lifted her chin, and picked up a folder from the passenger seat. Not the same folder from the anniversary dinner, a different one. It was pale gray. The color bothered me more than it should have. Martin was in the den when she came in, sitting in his recliner with the television on mute, watching a baseball game he had no interest in because men like him do not like being seen waiting. Caleb was not there, but his absence had weight. It had the shape of someone who had been discussed. Marissa hugged me at the door with one arm because the folder was in the other, and she smelled like expensive hand lotion and the inside of a car that had been recently detailed. Lemon, leather, something floral underneath. She kissed my cheek without touching it fully and said, "You look tired." That is how she started. Not hello, not how are you. You look tired. There are sentences that are not insults until you understand what they are being used to prepare. I am 68, I said. Sometimes my face tells the truth. She gave a small laugh, the kind she uses when she wants to move past something without answering it. Can we sit? We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Caleb had explained 3 businesses, where Marissa had dropped off dresses for me to fix, where Martin had once spread out brochures for a boat we could not afford, and acted offended when I asked what we would sell to pay for it. The table had a small burn mark near the far edge from a casserole dish I set down without a trivet in 1998, and every time I see it, I remember being too tired that night to care whether the wood was ruined. It wasn't. It just kept the mark. Martin came in after we sat, moving slowly, pretending he had not been listening from the next room. He poured himself coffee he did not need and leaned against the counter instead of joining us, which was one of his favorite little performances. Standing made him look less involved, less responsible, like he had wandered in by accident and was simply available if reason was required. Marissa placed the gray folder on the table, but did not open it right away. "Mom," she said, "I know this has all felt sudden. Felt, not was. I know it's a lot," she continued, "and I know you don't like people stepping in." I looked at her hands. Her nails were pale pink, squared at the tips, one tiny chip on the thumbnail of her right hand. She noticed me noticing and tucked her thumb under her fingers. "But Dad and I have been talking," she said. "Have you?" Martin lifted his mug but did not drink. "And Caleb too," she added, like she was placing him gently into the sentence where he would do the least damage. "We're worried." There it was again, concern, arranged like furniture to block an exit. "About what?" I asked. Marissa's eyes softened. I have seen her do that to clients, to waiters, to teachers when she was a girl and had forgotten assignments she did not want to admit she had ignored. "About you." I let that sit between us. She opened the folder. Inside was another document, cleaner than the last, better formatted, with my name typed in bold near the top. I did not touch it. I read upside down because you learn certain skills when you spend your life sitting across from people who assume paper only faces one direction. Family Asset Management Agreement. Family again. It is remarkable how often people attach that word to things they should be ashamed to ask for directly. "This isn't taking anything from you," Marissa said, already answering the objection I had not made. "It's just allowing Dad to help manage things if you get overwhelmed." "If," I said. She blinked. "What?" "You said if." "Yes." Martin said I already was. The kitchen went quiet in a very specific way. Not empty, calculating. Martin set his mug down too hard. The coffee inside moved against the rim but did not spill. "Eleanor, don't twist this." I turned to him. "I'm repeating it." Marissa leaned forward slightly. "Mom, nobody is saying you can't handle anything. We're saying it's smart to plan ahead. You faxed a power of attorney to the bank." Her face did not change fast enough. That was how I knew she had practiced a reaction, but not that reaction. The pause was small, barely a breath. But I have made dresses for women who lied about their measurements and mothers who lied about what they could afford. and I know the half second when a person decides which version of themselves to use. "I don't know what you mean," she said. Martin looked at her then, not at me, at her. That mattered too. I reached for my purse, which was hanging on the back of the chair beside me, and pulled out nothing. I did not need the paper, not yet. I just wanted to watch them watch me reach for it. Marissa's eyes dropped to the bag, then came back up. Martin's hand tightened around the mug. "I spoke to the bank," I said. Marissa's mouth opened slightly, just enough for surprise to show before she closed it. "Why would you do that?" It was such a beautiful question in its own terrible way. Not, "Why would the bank call you?" Not, "What did they say?" Why would you do that? As if checking on my own money were the suspicious act. "Because it's mine," I said. Martin pushed off the counter. "Ours." I looked at him. He looked back. There are marriages that end in shouting, and there are marriages that end in a single word being corrected after 40 years. "No," I said. "Mine." The room shifted then. Not visibly, maybe, not to someone standing outside the window looking in, but inside the room, every old arrangement moved slightly out of place. Martin's jaw tightened. Marissa looked down at the paper. The refrigerator clicked on behind us, a low hum filling the silence like a witness that had been waiting its turn. Marissa recovered first because she always does. "Mom, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You're becoming defensive over nothing." "Nothing," I said. "It's paperwork." Paperwork is where people hide things they don't want to say out loud. She smiled then, but it did not reach her eyes. "You're making this harder than it has to be." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because I had heard that sentence in different forms my entire adult life. From Martin, when the numbers did not support what he wanted. From Caleb, when repayment became inconvenient. From Marissa, when a favor stopped feeling like one. "You're making this harder." As if difficulty begins at the moment you stop cooperating. I folded my hands on the table. "Which account were you trying to manage?" Marissa glanced at Martin again. There it was, the tiny thread between them pulled tight. "We're not discussing details like this while you're upset," Martin said. "I'm not upset." "You are." "No," I said. "I'm paying attention." He did not like that. I saw it in the way his shoulders moved back, like I had stepped too close without standing up. Marissa slid the paper toward me. "Just read it." "I have." "You haven't even touched it." "I read upside down." That stopped her for a second, not because it mattered, but because it reminded her I had always known more than they gave me credit for. I looked down at the document again. There was a place for my signature. There was a place for Martin's. There was a section naming Marissa as secondary contact, advisory capacity, no fiduciary authority unless authorized. It sounded harmless if you did not understand how harmless language can be used to open dangerous doors. "Who drafted this?" I asked. "A colleague helped," Marissa said. "From your office?" "It doesn't matter." "It matters." Martin stepped in then, voice lower. "Eleanor, we're not doing an interrogation at the kitchen table." "No," I said. "You tried the bank first." Marissa's face changed again, and this time it was not surprise. It was irritation. The real kind. The kind that leaks through when politeness stops working. "I was trying to protect you," she said. "From what?" "From mistakes." "Whose?" She looked at me for a long moment. "You don't always see how things look." That one landed closer than the others, not because it was clever, but because it was old. Women my age hear it in different forms. You're tired, you're confused, you're emotional. You don't understand how things work now. The words change, the function does not. They are meant to move you from owner to obstacle. I picked up the document then, not because I intended to sign it, because fingerprints matter. I turned the pages slowly, letting the paper make its little dry sound against itself. Martin watched my hands. Marissa watched my face. I watched the document. There were no coffee stains, no creases, no handwritten notes. Too clean. Prepared somewhere else. Brought here to make me feel like the meeting had already started before I arrived. "This is better than the first one," I said. Marissa went still. Martin said, "What first one?" Too quickly. I looked up, and for one clean second, neither of them had a usable face. That was the moment I kept. Not the lies before it, not the explanations after. That 1 second when husband and daughter both realized they had not practiced for the same question. I set the paper back on the table. "I'm not signing tonight." Marissa drew in a breath. "Mom!" "Or Sunday." Martin's voice hardened. "We have people coming Sunday." "I know. This is not something you embarrass the family over." I looked at him, at the man who had stood in a church hall and told people my mind was slipping, so he could make my refusal look like proof. "No," I said, "it isn't." For a moment, he seemed relieved. Then I added, "So be careful what you bring in front of them." Marissa closed the folder slowly. Her hands were steadier than her face. "You're making a mistake," she said. I stood, taking my purse from the chair. "Write that down." She frowned. "What?" "You seem concerned about my memory." The color rose in her cheeks then. Not much, just enough. Martin looked away first. I walked them to the door because habit is stubborn, and some part of me still remembered being the kind of woman who saw people out even after they had come into her kitchen to take from her. Marissa stepped onto the porch without looking back. Martin paused beside the hall table, his keys in the ceramic dish with the blue crack, the silver one still bright among the older brass. He picked them up. I watched his hand close around them. "You're going to regret this," he said softly. There are threats that come dressed as warnings because the person saying them still wants to feel civilized. I opened the door wider. "No," I said. "I think I'm done doing that for you." He left without another word. I closed the door, turned the lock, and stood there with my hand still on the deadbolt, listening to the sound of their car doors outside, one after the other, then the engine, then the slow pull away from the curb. Only after the street went quiet did I go back to the kitchen table. The gray folder was gone. But the document had left something behind. A single corner of the cover sheet, torn loose under the chair where Marissa had been sitting, small enough that she had missed it, large enough to show the letterhead. Whitcomb Family Holdings, LLC. And beneath it, in smaller print, an address I had never seen before. I did not pick up the torn corner of the cover sheet right away, because there is a difference between finding something and letting yourself understand what it means. I stood beside the kitchen table for a moment with my hand still resting on the back of the chair Marissa had used, looking down at that small white triangle of paper under the leg, and I remember thinking how unimpressive evidence can look before it ruins someone. No dramatic envelope, no red stamp, no confession written in a shaking hand. Just one torn corner with a company name and an address I had never seen before, lying on my kitchen floor beside a crumb from the toast Martin had eaten that morning and not cleaned up. Whitcomb Family Holdings, LLC. The name sat there like it belonged to a family I was not part of. I picked it up with 2 fingers and turned it over, though there was nothing on the back except a faint gray line where the printer had pulled the paper unevenly. I carried it to the counter and set it beside my notebook, smoothing it flat with the side of my hand. The address was in Harrisburg, printed in small text under the company name. Not an office, not a bank, not Marissa's real estate firm. A registered agent service. I knew enough to know what that meant. Somebody had created a company designed to look official without needing a real front door. A name, a mailbox, a filing fee, and suddenly theft has stationery. That is what people misunderstand about paperwork. They think papers make things legitimate. Papers only make things traceable. I opened my notebook to a clean page and wrote the name at the top, pressing hard enough that I could feel the letters bite into the sheet beneath it. Whitcomb Family Holdings, LLC. Then the address. Then the date. Then the names I already had connected to it, not because all of them were proven yet, but because a line between facts is not the same thing as an accusation if you draw it carefully enough. Martin, Marissa, Caleb, attempted POA, fax cover, forged signature, workroom footage. The refrigerator clicked on behind me, that low, familiar hum filling the kitchen while I wrote, and I remember the sound clearly because it kept the room from feeling too quiet. There are moments when silence gives people too much space in your head. I have learned to let ordinary noises stay. The refrigerator, the clock in the hallway, a car passing outside, the small scrape of my pen against the paper. Ordinary things remind you that the world has not stopped just because someone has tried to rearrange yours. The next morning, I called David Harlan again. I did not wait until a more reasonable hour, unless you consider 8:03 reasonable, which I do when people have been forging your name after midnight. His receptionist put me through after one sentence. I think she had already decided, from the first visit, that I was not someone calling about a neighbor's fence. "I found the LLC," I said when he answered. There was no hello wasted between us. I appreciated that. "Name?" "Whitcomb Family Holdings." I heard paper move on his end. "Registered where?" "Harrisburg. Agent address. I have part of the cover sheet." "Part?" Marissa tore it without noticing. A pause. Not long, but enough for him to understand the kind of household we were discussing. "Send me a photograph of it," he said. "Then bring the original when you come in." "I'm coming in?" "Yes," he said. "And this time I want you to bring the notebook." I looked down at it on the counter, the blue cover faded at the spine, one corner bent from being pushed into purses and drawers and glove compartments over too many years. It did not look like evidence. It looked like an old habit. That is why it was useful. I arrived at his office just before 10, with the notebook in my purse, the torn cover sheet in a plastic sandwich bag because it was the closest thing I had to an evidence sleeve, and a paper coffee cup from the gas station that I bought and never drank from because the lid smelled faintly like burnt plastic. The woman at the front desk looked at the bag in my hand and then at my face, and this time she did not ask if I had an appointment. David had another woman in the office when I walked in, sitting in the chair near the window with a legal pad on her lap and a pen tucked behind one ear. She was maybe 55, maybe older, with short gray hair cut neatly at her jaw and glasses on a chain that should have made her look gentle, but did not. She looked at me the way some women look at a hemline, not judging it, just noticing whether it is straight. "This is Nora Finch," David said. "She handles financial abuse cases, trust disputes, and family fraud." Family fraud. I hated how clean those words sounded. Nora stood and shook my hand. Her grip was dry, firm, not trying to prove anything. "Mrs. Whitcomb?" "Eleanor," I said. She nodded once. "Then I'm Nora." I placed the sandwich bag on David's desk, and both of them looked at it without touching it at first. That was when I knew they were the right people. Careless people grab evidence. Careful people let it sit long enough to respect what it might become. David took a photo of the paper through the plastic before removing it. Nora watched him, then wrote something on her legal pad. "You kept this after they left?" she asked. "It was under the chair." "Marissa's chair?" "Yes." "And you know the address was connected to the attempted bank document?" "The fax header had the same company name," I said. "The bank has that copy." Nora wrote again. Her handwriting was small and slanted, almost impatient, like the words were trying to keep up with her mind. "Tell me everything in order," she said. So I did. Not emotionally, not dramatically. I had already learned that when something is serious enough, you do not need to make it sound worse than it is. I told her about the silver key on Martin's ring, the workroom drawer, Caleb asking for my laptop passcode, Marissa's questions about accounts, the camera, the 214 alert, the forged signature, the bank call, the attempted power of attorney, the gray folder, the phrase family asset management agreement, Martin correcting mine to ours, and Marissa asking why I had called the bank as if that were the part that needed explaining. Laura did not interrupt often. When she did, the questions were sharp and specific. Was Caleb aware he was signing your name? Yes. How do you know? He asked Martin if he was sure before he signed it. David looked up at that. On video? Nora asked. Yes. Did Martin instruct him? He said, "We're not waiting any longer." Nora's pen stopped. There are sentences that change a room even when repeated secondhand. That was one of them. She wrote it down exactly. Then she asked about the trust, and I told her what my mother had set up, how the account required verification, how Martin had been removed as trusted contact before the attempt, how the bank had flagged the document before anything moved. Nora listened with her head slightly tilted, and when I finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at David, then at me. They didn't steal from the account, she said. They tried to create authority over it. Yes. That matters. I know. It can matter more, she said, because it shows intent before access. I sat with that. Intent before access. The law had a language for the moment before the door opens. I had always known it existed in ordinary life, in pauses, in questions, in hands hovering over drawers. It helped, in a strange way, to hear that it had a name somewhere outside my kitchen. David folded his hands on the desk. We need to secure the trust formally and notify the bank in writing through counsel. Do it, I said. Nora looked at me. We also need to decide how visible you want this to become. I thought of Martin in the church hall, holding the microphone. I thought of Marissa placing the folder in front of me in front of witnesses, the way she had said it was just to make things easier. I thought of Caleb recording me like he wanted proof that I was becoming the woman they had already described. They made it visible, I said. Nora did not smile, but something in her face approved of the answer. Then we do this properly, she said. Not loudly, properly. I liked her for that. By the time I left, there was a plan, and plans are quieter than revenge in the beginning, which is why people underestimate them. David would send notice to the bank, to the registered agent, and to the state requesting records connected to the LLC. Nora would prepare documentation in case a protective financial order was needed. I would preserve the video footage, print my records, forward every message, and change nothing about my behavior at home unless safety required it. That last part stayed with me. Change nothing. It's harder than people think to behave normally around people whose lies you can now hold in your hand. It's harder to pour coffee into the same mug, to answer ordinary questions, to fold towels, to ask whether the mail came, when you know that the person across the room has begun building a version of your life that does not require your permission. But there is power in routine when people are watching for panic. Panic tells them where they hit you. Routine makes them wonder whether they missed. When I got home, Martin was in the driveway, standing beside Caleb's truck. Caleb was there. I had not expected him that early, though I should have. The men in my family always arrived in pairs when they wanted to feel larger than the truth. Caleb leaned against the truck with his arms crossed, trying to look casual, but one foot kept tapping against the concrete. Martin held an envelope in his left hand. Not a folder this time, an envelope. I pulled in slowly and parked in my usual spot, the one closest to the side door, because changing where I parked would have been a message, and I was not ready to send one. I turned off the car. The engine ticked. Caleb looked at the windshield instead of my face. Martin came around to my side before I opened the door.
Where were you?
He asked. At the store. The lie came out easily because it was small and useful, and because I had stopped believing truth was owed equally to people who were using it against me. You didn't bring anything in. I didn't find what I needed. He looked at me for a second too long. Caleb pushed off the truck. Mom, we need to talk. No, I said, opening the door. You need something. That stopped him. Not because it was harsh, because it was accurate. Martin's fingers tightened slightly around the envelope. I noticed the return address before he moved it behind his leg. Marissa's office. Same printed label, same clean font, different container. You're being difficult, Caleb said. There it was again, the family word for a locked door. I stepped out of the car and closed it gently. Am I? You know Dad's just trying to help. I looked at Martin then. He was watching me carefully, searching for the woman from before, the one who might apologize for making the air tense even when she had not caused the tension. "With what?" I asked. Caleb laughed once, short and humorless. "With you." That one landed. Not deeply, but cleanly, like a needle through fabric. For a second, I saw him at 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with cereal stuck to his sleeve, asking me to fix a toy truck because one wheel had come loose. I saw him at 17, angry because I would not sign for a car loan he could not afford. I saw him now, a grown man standing in my driveway, using concern as a tool he had not earned the right to hold. Martin stepped closer. "Sunday is important. We need everyone calm." "Everyone. Not me. Everyone." I nodded slowly. "Then be calm." Caleb looked at his father, then back at me. "Are you going to sign or not?" There it was, finally. Not concern, not planning, not family. The question under all of it. I took my keys from my purse and walked toward the side door. "I'll read whatever you bring me." "That's not an answer," Caleb said. I stopped with my hand on the railing, the paint chipped under my fingers where winter had lifted it in thin curls. "No," I said. "It's the only one you're getting today." Martin did not follow me inside. Caleb did not either. I heard their voices outside after I closed the door, low and uneven, not clear enough to make out words, but clear enough to know the rhythm had changed. They were not rehearsing anymore. They were adjusting. I set my purse on the kitchen chair and took out the notebook. My hand was not shaking, but the page looked slightly blurred for a moment, and I had to blink twice before the lines settled. Caleb present. Martin envelope. Pressure, Sunday. Asked if I would sign. Return address likely Marissa office. Then I added one more line. They are getting impatient. I closed the notebook and looked toward the workroom. The house sounded the same as it always had. Refrigerator, clock, a faint shift in the floorboards as the temperature changed. Outside, the truck door closed harder than necessary. They had started this by trying to take control quietly. Now they were beginning to realize quiet was not the same thing as safe. Sunday arrived the way days like that always do, without announcing itself as anything other than a date on a calendar, a square with a number in it that looks exactly like the others until you step into it and realize something has already been decided inside its borders. I woke before the alarm, not because I was nervous, but because my body has learned over the years that important days do not require sleep as much as they require clarity, and clarity arrives early if you let it. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets on Sunday mornings, the kind of quiet that feels arranged rather than natural, as if even the walls understand they are about to hold more voices than usual. The clock in the hallway read 6:12, the red numbers too bright against the dim light coming through the window, and for a moment I lay there looking at the ceiling, tracing the small crack near the corner that has been there since 2009, when the roof leaked for 2 days before Martin admitted it needed repair. I got up slowly, not because I needed to, but because there is a steadiness in routine that anchors you when everything else is about to shift. I made coffee in the same way I always have, measuring grounds without looking, filling the water to the line that is worn faint over time, listening for the first drip into the pot that tells you the machine is doing its job without needing to be watched. I poured it into the white mug with the hairline crack along the rim, the one I have kept long past the point where most people would have replaced it, and I held it in both hands for a moment before taking the first sip, letting the heat settle into my palms. There are people who believe that on days like this, you should do something different, wear something new, change the pattern enough that it feels like a marker, but I have always believed the opposite. You keep everything the same so that the change, when it comes, has nowhere to hide. By 9:30, the house had begun to fill. Martin's sister arrived first, carrying a pie in a dish she wrapped in a towel that had been embroidered years ago by someone who thought flowers on fabric could make ordinary meals feel like events. She kissed my cheek and told me I looked well, her eyes flicking briefly to Martin as if to confirm that this was still a safe sentence to say. Uncle Raymond followed, his voice already louder than necessary, talking about the drive as if distance were something he had conquered rather than completed. Marissa came in next, dressed more carefully than she needed to be, her hair pulled back in a way that exposed her face fully, leaving nothing for shadows to soften. She carried another folder, this one darker than the gray one from before, navy this time, thicker, more official in its presentation. Caleb arrived with Sophie 10 minutes later, his daughter hanging slightly behind him, her eyes moving from face to face with the quiet attention of someone who understands more than anyone has told her. I watched all of them move through the house as if I were seeing them from a distance, noting the small things that have always been there but rarely mattered until now. The way Martin positioned himself near the center of the room without appearing to claim it. The way Marissa set her folder down on the side table within easy reach. The way Caleb avoided looking at the workroom door, his gaze sliding past it as if it were a place that might look back. By noon, the table was set. Plates arranged evenly, glasses aligned in a way that suggested order even when nothing about the situation was orderly. The burn mark near the far edge caught the light just enough to remind me that nothing stays perfect no matter how carefully you maintain it. I placed the serving dishes where they had always gone, not because tradition mattered in that moment, but because breaking it would have been a signal, and I was not ready to give them anything they had not already taken. Dinner moved the way these things always do, with conversation that circles around itself, touching on weather, on work, on small complaints that require no solution, all of it filling the space before something heavier is placed at the center. I answered when spoken to. I smiled when it was expected. I passed the dishes in the correct direction. I did not rush. Halfway through the meal, Martin stood. He did not clear his throat. He did not tap his glass. He simply stood, and the room adjusted to him the way it always has, the conversations tapering off as people turn their attention toward the person who has decided he is about to say something worth hearing. "I want to say a few words," he began. Of course he did. He spoke about years, about building a life, about the kind of phrases that sound full until you look inside them and realize they are mostly air. He spoke about partnership, about responsibility, about making sure everything is taken care of as we get older, his voice steady, practiced, the rhythm of it familiar in a way that would have been comforting if I did not know what he had already tried to do in the dark. Marissa reached for the navy folder. I watched her hand move before anyone else did, the slight shift of her wrist, the way she positioned it so the paper inside would slide out cleanly when the moment came. Caleb leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on Martin, not on me. Sophie sat very still, her fork resting untouched on her plate, her eyes moving between the three of them with a focus that did not belong to a 17-year-old at a family dinner. "And because of that," Martin continued, "we've put something together." There it was. Marissa slid the document from the folder and placed it on the table in front of me, aligning it carefully with the edge as if precision could make it legitimate. "It's just to make things easier," she said softly, the same tone she had used before, the one designed to smooth over the edges of what she was actually asking. I looked down at the paper. It was the same agreement, cleaner, adjusted, the language tightened in places where I had pushed back, expanded in others where they believed I would not notice. The signature line was there, waiting, the pen placed beside it as if the act had already been decided and all that remained was the performance. I did not touch it. There is a moment in rooms like this when everyone expects a reaction, and the absence of it becomes louder than anything you could say. I let that moment stretch, feeling the weight of their attention, the way it pressed in from all sides, waiting for me to either confirm the story they had built or disrupt it in a way they had not planned for. I lifted my eyes. "Before I sign anything," I said, my voice even, not raised, not rushed, "I want to understand what I'm agreeing to." Martin nodded, relieved, I think, that I had not refused outright. "Of course." "What account is this for?" I asked. A small pause. "General oversight," he said. "That's not an account," I replied. Marissa leaned in. "Mom, it covers all your assets." "All of them?" I repeated. "Yes. Including the trust." There it was. The room shifted again, not visibly, but in that subtle way that tells you something has landed where it was not expected to. Martin's expression did not change immediately, which told me he had not planned for that question in that exact form. "That's part of it," he said. "Part of it," I repeated. Marissa's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the folder. "It's just a structure," she said. "A way to make sure nothing falls through the cracks." "Nothing," I said. Caleb cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet. "Mom, we're trying to help you." I turned to him. "With what?" "With everything," he said, the word broad enough to mean nothing and everything at once. I looked back at the paper. "Then help me understand this," I said, tapping the section near the bottom with one finger. "This clause gives management authority in the event of incapacity." "It's standard," Marissa said quickly. "Incapacity," I repeated, "defined how?" "Mom," she said, her tone shifting slightly, impatience edging into it. "You're overthinking this." There it was again. I let my hand rest on the table. "I spoke to the bank on Friday," I said. Silence. Not the kind that fills a room naturally, the kind that removes everything else. Martin's head turned slightly toward me, his eyes narrowing in a way that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who did not spend 40 years learning the difference between his expressions. "Why would you do that?" Marissa asked, the same question in the same tone, as if repeating it might change the answer. "Because someone tried to access my account," I said. Caleb shifted in his chair. "What are you talking about?" Martin said, his voice lower now, the practiced warmth thinning at the edges. I reached into my purse. This time, I took something out. Not the notebook. The printed copy of the bank. I placed it on the table beside their version, aligning it the same way Marissa had aligned hers, paper next to paper, one clean, one marked by a process they had not expected me to enter. "This," I said, tapping the second page, "was submitted to my bank 2 days ago." Marissa's face went still. Martin did not look at her. He looked at the paper. Caleb looked at neither of them. He looked at me. "That's not," Marissa began. "It is," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "The signature is wrong," I continued, my finger moving to the line where my name had been written in a hand that was not mine. "The authorization is false, and the account is protected in a way that makes this document useless." No one spoke. I could hear the clock in the hallway again, the soft, steady tick that had been there all morning, unnoticed until now. Sophie moved first, not much, just enough to shift her chair slightly, the legs scraping against the floor with a small sound that broke the stillness just enough to remind everyone that there were more people in the room than the 3 who had built this plan. "You said this was new," I said, looking at Marissa. "It is," she said, but the word did not hold. "You said it was just to help," I continued. "It is," she repeated, softer now. "Then why did you send this first?" I let the question sit. I did not answer it for them. I did not fill the space. Because sometimes, the most effective thing you can do is allow the truth to exist without interruption, and watch what people do when they have to stand next to it. Martin's hand moved slightly toward the navy folder, then stopped. Caleb looked down at his plate. Marissa opened her mouth, then closed it again, the practiced sentences not quite fitting the moment they had found themselves in. I reached for the pen beside the document, not to sign, to move it. I placed it back on the table, closer to them than to me. "I'm not signing today," I said. The words landed cleanly. No apology, no explanation, just a fact. The room held that for a moment, the weight of it settling into the spaces between us, into the cracks that had been there long before this day but had never been forced open this far. Martin exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured. "We can revisit this," he said. "Yes," I replied. We could, but not in the way he meant. I folded the bank document once and slid it back into my purse, leaving their version on the table where Marissa had placed it, untouched, exactly as it had been when she set it down. Then I picked up my fork and continued eating, because the meal had not ended, and neither had I. After the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured, the house did not return to its usual Sunday shape, and that is something you feel more than you see, a subtle misalignment in the way people sit, in the way their voices land in the room, in the way laughter either comes too quickly or not at all. The table had been wiped, the burn mark still faintly visible beneath the sheen of the cloth. And Marissa's navy folder remained where she had left it, closed now, its edges too sharp against the softened look of everything else. I carried the dishes to the sink because that is what I have always done. Because there is a rhythm to clearing a table that does not require permission. And I let my hands move through the motions while my attention stayed on the room behind me. Water ran over ceramic, a steady sound that filled the space between words, and I listened to the conversation shift in small ways, not toward resolution, but toward avoidance. Martin spoke to his sister about a neighbor's fence. Caleb asked Uncle Raymond about the game. Marissa checked her phone twice in less than a minute, her thumb moving quickly over the screen, then stopping, then starting again. The small habits of someone trying to manage something that has begun to move without her. I dried my hands on the blue striped towel and turned back to the room. "I need a few minutes," I said. The sentence was simple, and because it was simple, it did not invite argument. "Of course," Martin replied, too quickly, the word landing before he had time to decide whether it should. "I'd like you all to stay," I added, looking at each of them in turn, not lingering, not pressing, just enough to make it clear that this was not a suggestion. They stayed. There are moments when people recognize that leaving would say more than remaining, and this was one of them. I walked to the workroom without looking back, not because I needed to, but because I wanted the distance between rooms to exist, to give them time to consider what staying meant, to let the house hold them in place while I prepared the next step. The workroom smelled the same as it always had, cotton and chalk and that faint trace of lavender that never fully disappears. The late afternoon light had shifted, the angle different now, stretching across the cutting table in a way that made the surface look longer than it was. The camera sat quietly on the shelf, its small dark eye pointed toward the cabinet, toward the door, toward the place where decisions had already been made without me. I did not rush. I opened the drawer the way it needed to be opened, lifting slightly before sliding it out, the movement familiar enough that my hands did not have to think about it. The folder was still there, the copied documents resting where Caleb had placed them, the forged signature settled into the paper as if it had always belonged there. I took the folder and set it on the table, then reached into the cabinet above for the small external drive I keep wrapped in a piece of cloth, the one with the frayed edge that caught on everything if you weren't careful. I connected it to the laptop, opened the application, and watched as the files loaded, each date stamped clearly, each clip arranged in a line that told a story without needing to explain itself. 2:14 a.m. The file name was simple. It did not need to be anything else. I selected it, not because I needed to watch it again, but because I wanted to confirm that it was there, that it had not changed, that the record remained exactly as it had been when it was created. The thumbnail showed the room in grayscale, the door closed, the cabinet in frame, the quiet before movement. I closed the laptop. There is a moment before you carry something into a room like that, a pause where you can still choose to do something else, to let things settle into a quieter version of themselves, to accept a smaller truth in place of a larger one. I stood there for that moment, the folder in one hand, the drive in the other, and I let it pass. When I returned to the kitchen, they were exactly where I had left them, though nothing about them felt the same. Martin stood near the counter now, his posture adjusted slightly. His weight shifted from one foot to the other in a way that would have looked casual if you did not know how long he had been standing there. Marissa sat at the table, her hands folded in front of her, the folder still closed, her eyes moving to the doorway before I fully entered. Caleb leaned against the back of a chair, one hand resting on it, the other at his side, his fingers tapping once, then stopping. Sophie had moved to the far end of the table, her chair angled slightly away, as if she were giving herself space to see everything without being directly inside it. I set the folder on the table beside Marissa's. I placed the drive next to it. No one spoke. I opened the folder first. The copied document slid out easily, the pages separating with that small, dry sound paper makes when it has been handled just enough to lose its stiffness. I turned them so they faced outward, not toward me, aligning them in a way that made the signature visible, the line clear, the space where my name had been written by someone else, unmistakable. Then I reached for the laptop. I did not rush the motion. I did not make it dramatic. I opened it the way I always do, the hinge moving smoothly, the screen lifting to meet the room. I connected the drive, the small click audible in the quiet, and navigated to the file without looking down more than necessary. When I turned the screen, I made sure everyone could see it. "This," I said, my voice even, "is from Thursday night." I pressed play. The room on the screen appeared in black and white, the same soft edges, the same quiet before movement. For a second, nothing happened, and then the door opened. Martin's hand moved toward the back of the chair. Caleb did not move at all. Marissa's breath caught, a small sound, barely there, but enough. I did not look at them. I watched the screen. I let the footage speak. They entered the room the way they had entered it that night. Careful, controlled, quiet in a way that now looked different, stripped of the context they had relied on to make it seem reasonable. Caleb moved to the drawer, the hesitation visible now in the way his hand paused before pulling it open, the small resistance when it caught, the adjustment when he forced it. "Which one?" His voice said from the speakers, softer than it had been in memory. "Third," Martin's voice answered. No one in the room around me spoke. On the screen, the folder opened, the pages turned, the pen appeared, the question was asked. "You sure? We're not waiting any longer." The sentence landed again, heavier this time, because it was no longer mine to repeat. It belonged to the room. Caleb's hand moved across the page, the signature forming in that same angled line, the letters leaning where they should not lean, the motion too quick to be careful, too deliberate to be accidental. I let it play through to the end. I did not stop it early. I did not pause it for emphasis. I let the entire thing exist in front of them, uninterrupted, unedited, exactly as it had happened. When it finished, the screen returned to stillness. The room did not. I closed the laptop gently, the soft click of it sealing the moment in a way that felt final without needing to be announced. Then I looked at them. Martin's face had changed in a way I had not seen before. Not anger, not denial, but something closer to calculation failing, the realization that a version of events he had been holding together no longer had enough pieces to stand. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, his jaw tightening as if he were trying to find a sentence that would not collapse under its own weight. Marissa's hands were no longer folded. They rested on the table, fingers spread slightly, as if she needed to feel the surface beneath them to remain steady. Her eyes moved from the closed laptop to the documents, then to me. The softness gone, replaced by something sharper, more direct. The look of someone who has realized that the conversation has moved beyond where she can guide it. Caleb looked at the floor. That, more than anything else, told me where the fault line was. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask them to explain. I did not fill the silence they had created. Instead, I placed my hand on the edge of the table and spoke the one thing that needed to be said. "You tried to take control of my life," I said, each word clear, each one placed exactly where it belonged. Without asking, without telling me, without thinking I would see it. No one interrupted, no one corrected me, no one called me dramatic. I let the words settle. Then I added, not louder, not softer, just as steady as before. "And now you know that I did." The house held that. The refrigerator hummed. The clock in the hallway continued its steady count. Outside, a car passed, the sound moving along the street and fading in a way that suggested the world beyond the walls was still turning, still indifferent, still exactly as it had been before any of this began. Inside, nothing was the same. No one spoke for a long time after the laptop closed, and it wasn't the kind of silence people use to think of something to say. It was the kind that arrives when the options have already been reduced to fewer than anyone is comfortable admitting. I stood where I was, my hand still resting lightly on the edge of the table, feeling the faint groove in the wood where the finish had worn thin over the years. And I let that silence do its work, because there are moments when anything you add only gives someone else material to rearrange. Caleb moved first, not dramatically, not in a way that asked for attention, just a shift of weight from one foot to the other, his shoulder lifting slightly as if he were trying to loosen something that had tightened without his permission. He did not look up immediately, and when he did, his eyes did not come to me. They went to Martin, searching for direction in the same way he had when he was 12 and waiting to be told whether something he had done was a problem or a story that could be explained away. Martin did not give him anything. He stood near the counter, the mug still in his hand, though he had not taken a sip in several minutes. his fingers wrapped around it as if the shape might anchor him in a moment that had begun to slip. He looked at the table, at the documents, at the space where the pen had been placed earlier, as if it might still be there if he looked long enough. "This isn't what it looks like," he said finally. There are sentences that carry so much history in them that you can hear every previous use at once, every time they have been deployed to soften something that should have been faced directly. I did not respond to it, not because I didn't have an answer, but because answering that sentence is how it continues. Marissa did not wait for him. She leaned forward, her hands coming together in front of her again, but this time the movement was not controlled, not arranged. There was a small tremor in her fingers that she did not quite manage to still. "Mom," she said, and the words sounded different now, stripped of the tone she had used before, the careful softness replaced by something closer to urgency. "You're taking this out of context." I looked at her. "Which part?" I asked. She opened her mouth, then paused, the question catching on something she had not prepared for. "The part where you and Dad were just trying to," she began, and then stopped again, recalibrating mid-sentence. "We were trying to put a structure in place. You've been under a lot of stress, and you don't always see how things can go wrong until they already have." It was almost impressive, the way she could still find a version of that sentence that did not quite collapse under the weight of what we had all just watched. Caleb let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had been allowed to complete itself. "She's right," he said, and his voice was steadier than I expected, though there was something brittle under it, a tension that made each word land a fraction harder than it needed to. "We weren't trying to take anything. We were trying to make sure everything stayed where it should be." "By signing my name," I said. He flinched, not visibly to anyone who did not know him. But I have watched that boy turn into a man, and I know the exact moment when his body recognizes a truth before his mind has found a way to respond to it. "You weren't going to," he said. "You've been resisting." Resisting. The word settled between us, and for a second I saw him at 17 again, angry because I would not co-sign alone, telling me I was being difficult, that I didn't understand how things worked now, that everyone else's parents were doing it differently. Some arguments do not end, they just change language. Martin set the mug down then, the sound louder than it should have been against the quiet. "Enough," he said. And his voice had lost the practiced calm it had held earlier, the edges sharper now, less controlled. "We're not going to turn this into something it isn't." "It already is something," I said. He looked at me, and for a moment there was a flash of something that might have been anger, might have been fear, might have been the recognition that the version of me he had relied on was no longer available to him. "You're overreacting," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm reacting to exactly what happened." Marissa pushed her chair back slightly, the legs scraping against the floor in a way that made Sophie wince at the far end of the table. "We should have talked to you first," Marissa said, and for the first time there was something in her voice that did not feel arranged, a small crack where something real might have been trying to get through. "But you haven't been listening. Every time we try to bring this up, you shut it down." I let that sit for a moment, not because I needed to consider it, but because I wanted her to hear it in the air, to recognize the shape of it outside of her own mouth. "I shut down conversations that begin with conclusions," I said, "not questions." She looked at me, and for a second, just a second, I saw the girl she had been at 12, standing in the doorway of this same kitchen, asking if she could go to a friend's house, and already knowing the answer because she had decided it before she asked. That version of her had learned quickly how to ask questions that contained their own answers. "This isn't about control," she said, quieter now. "It's about protection." "Whose?" I asked. She did not answer. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, the motion restless, familiar, the same way he had done it as a child when something did not go the way he expected, and he had not yet learned how to hide that. "You're making this bigger than it is," he said. I looked at him. "It's a felony," I said. The word landed differently than anything else I had said, not because they did not know it, because they had been choosing not to say it. Martin's jaw tightened. "We're not going to use words like that in this house," he said. "This house," I repeated, and I heard the way the word shifted even as I said it. the ownership of it no longer sitting where it had for years. Yes, he said, more firmly now, as if repetition could re-establish something that had already moved. No, I said just as firmly. Not like that. The room stilled again, but this time it was different, less uncertain, more defined, as if the boundaries had been drawn clearly enough that everyone could see where they stood, even if they did not like the view. Sophie spoke then. It was quiet, almost hesitant, but it carried in the silence because no one expected it. "Dad," she said, and Caleb turned toward her as if he had forgotten she was there. "Why did you sign Grandma's name?" The question was simple. That is why it worked. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it, the practiced responses he had been using dissolving in the face of something that did not accept them as answers. "I didn't think it would matter," he said finally, and the honesty of it was so clean it almost felt like a relief. There it was, not strategy, not protection, not family, convenience. I felt something in my chest settle into place, not a release, not forgiveness, just a recognition that the thing I had been watching from the edges was now fully visible in the center. "It matters," I said. He nodded, once, a small movement that did not fix anything but acknowledged the truth of the statement. Marissa looked at him, then at me, then back at the documents on the table, her hand moving toward the folder as if to gather it, to put it away, to remove the physical evidence of what had just been exposed. "Don't," I said. She stopped. "Leave it," I continued. She let her hand fall back to the table. Martin exhaled slowly, the sound controlled again, as if he were trying to rebuild something from the remains of what had just been dismantled. "What do you want?" he asked. It was the first honest question of the afternoon. I considered it. Not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to place it correctly, to make sure it landed where it could not be moved or softened or reinterpreted. "I want this documented," I said. Marissa frowned. "Documented how?" "Properly," I replied. "Through counsel, through the bank, through the state if necessary." Martin's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're going to involve outsiders in this?" "They're already involved," I said. "You sent them paperwork." He did not respond to that. Caleb shifted again, his hand resting on the back of the chair, the same position he had been in when I walked in earlier. But the energy had changed, the certainty gone, replaced by something less stable. "This is going to blow up," he said. "Yes," I said. Marissa looked at me, her expression tightening. "You don't have to do that." "I do." "For what?" she pressed. "To prove a point?" "To make sure this doesn't happen again," I said. She shook her head slightly, frustration edging back into her voice. "You think we're going to do this again?" I met her eyes. "I think you did it once," I said. "Without asking, without telling me, without thinking I would see it." The words echoed what I had said before, but they landed differently now, reinforced by everything that had come between. That changes things. No one argued with that. The room held it, the weight of it settling into each of them in different ways. Martin looked away first. Marissa closed the folder slowly, her movements careful again, the practiced control returning in pieces. Caleb did not move. Sophie watched all of it, her eyes steady, her face unreadable in a way that told me she would remember this long after the rest of them tried to forget. I gathered the documents from the table, not quickly, not protectively, just returning them to the folder they belonged in, aligning the edges, making sure nothing was left out of place. When I stood, the chair behind me shifted slightly, the sound small but clear. "I'll be in the workroom," I said. No one tried to stop me. As I walked down the hallway, I could feel the house around me again. The walls, the floor, the small imperfections that had always been there. The crack in the ceiling, the worn spot near the light switch. The familiar shape of a space that had held my life for decades. Inside the workroom, I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment. Not because I needed support, but because I wanted to feel the solidness of it, the certainty of something that could still be closed, still be controlled. I took out the notebook. Date, time, Sunday, confrontation. Video shown. Admission. I didn't think it would matter. I underlined that once. Not heavily, just enough to mark it. Then I added one more line beneath it. They know I know. I closed the notebook and set it on the table, the blue cover catching the light from the window. Somewhere in the house, a chair moved, a door opened, voices shifted. But inside that room, everything had become very still. And for the first time since the camera alert, I understood something clearly enough to write it down without hesitation. They were no longer planning. They were reacting. Monday morning did not feel like the morning after something had broken. It felt like the morning after something had been named, which is a quieter kind of shift, but in some ways more permanent, because once a thing has a name, it stops being flexible. You can no longer bend it into something softer without knowing exactly what you are doing. I woke at 6:03, before the alarm, the same way I had the day before. And for a moment, I lay there listening to the house, waiting for some sign that it understood what had happened inside it. The refrigerator clicked on, the pipes made their small, familiar sounds, and somewhere in the distance, a car door closed. The ordinary markers of a morning that had not been consulted about any of this. I got up and dressed without thinking too much about what I chose, which is how I knew I had already decided. The gray cardigan with the missing button at the cuff, the one I keep meaning to fix but never do. The black slacks that have been hemmed twice because my posture changed over the years in ways I did not notice until I saw it in the mirror. I made coffee, poured it into the same mug, stood at the counter, and drank half of it without tasting it. Not because I was distracted, but because I was already somewhere else in my mind, moving through the steps that needed to be taken. Martin had left early. That, more than anything else, told me what I needed to know about how he was experiencing this. He does not leave early unless there is something he does not want to be present for. His mug was in the sink, a thin ring of coffee dried along the inside, the way it does when it sits too long without being rinsed. His keys were gone from the ceramic dish by the door, the silver one no longer catching the light. Caleb had not called. Marissa had not texted. Silence again, but this time not the kind that waits, the kind that retreats. I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me, the blue cover folded back, the pages filled now with more than dates and small observations, with lines that connected moments that had once felt separate and now sat together in a way that made them impossible to ignore. They know I know. They are reacting. Admission. I didn't think it would matter. I read those lines once, not because I needed to remember them, but because I wanted to feel the weight of them in one place before I moved forward. Then I closed the notebook, slid it into my purse, and picked up the folder with the documents, the edges still aligned from the night before. At 8:47, I was sitting in Nora Finch's office again. She looked at me the way she had the first time. Not surprised, not rushed, just taking in the fact of my presence and adjusting her expectations accordingly. "You brought it," she said, nodding toward the folder. "And more," I replied, setting it on the desk. David was there as well, a stack of papers in front of him, a pen resting across the top in a way that suggested it had been placed there intentionally, not set down in passing. "Start with what happened yesterday," Nora said. So I did. I told them about the dinner, about the document placed in front of me, about the questions, about the bank printout, about the way the room had shifted when the truth entered it in a form that could not be softened. I told them about the video, about the moment it played, about the sentence that had landed in the room as if it had always belonged there. I didn't think it would matter. Nora wrote it down again, this time underlining it once, the motion deliberate. "Good," she said, not because the situation was good, but because the clarity was. David leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. "That's enough," he said. "For what?" I asked. "For this to move forward without them," he replied. There was something in the way he said it that shifted the frame of the conversation, not from family to strangers, but from something informal to something structured, something that would now exist outside the house, outside the kitchen table, outside the reach of the narratives they had been building. Nora closed her notebook and looked at me directly. "We're filing," she said. The word sat there for a moment. "Filing what?" I asked, though I already understood the shape of it. A formal notice of attempted financial exploitation, she said, along with documentation of forgery and intent. Will include the video, the bank record, the LLC connection, and the admission. Against whom? I asked. All three, she said. Martin, Marissa, Caleb. The names did not need to be spoken for me to feel them. There will be consequences, David added, his tone even, not warning, not reassuring, just stating a fact. I know, I said. Nora watched me for a moment, as if she were checking for something that might not be visible in the words alone. You don't have to do this all at once, she said. We can structure it in stages. Protective orders first, then escalation if necessary. I considered that. Not because I needed time, but because I wanted to be sure that what I was choosing matched what had already been done. They did it all at once, I said. She nodded. Then we proceed, she replied. The rest of the morning moved in a way that felt both slow and precise, like something being measured carefully before it is cut. Documents were reviewed, copies made, statements drafted in language that did not carry emotion but did not need to. Words like unauthorized, forged, intent, attempted access, placed in order, each one holding its weight without needing emphasis. I signed where I needed to sign. My signature, left-leaning, clear, consistent. When I left the office, the air outside felt colder than it had in the morning, though I knew it was the same temperature. Sometimes clarity sharpens everything around it, makes edges more visible, makes ordinary sensations feel more exact. I drove home with the radio off, the sound of the tires against the road steady, the same route I have taken for years now, holding a different kind of meaning, not because the road had changed, but because I had. When I pulled into the driveway, Martin's car was there. He was standing on the porch, waiting. That too was new. He did not wait. He arranges. He positions. He arrives. He does not stand still unless something has forced him to. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, the faint impression of the leather pattern pressing into my palms. Then I opened the door and stepped out. He watched me walk up the path, his expression controlled. But there was something under it now, something that had not been there before, a tension that had not yet found a way to present itself as something else. Where were you? He asked. At the attorney's office, I said. I did not soften it. I did not adjust the word. I let it sit exactly as it was. His face changed, not dramatically, but enough. You didn't have to do that, he said. I did. For what? He pressed. To document what you did, I replied. He shook his head slightly, a small movement, almost reflexive. This is still family, he said. I looked at him. No, I said. This is now a record. The word landed between us in a way that felt different from everything that had come before it. Record. Not memory, not argument, not interpretation. Something fixed, something external, something that would exist whether he acknowledged it or not. Marissa's car pulled up behind mine before he could respond. She stepped out quickly, the door closing harder than necessary, her movements sharper than they had been the day before. What did you do? She asked, not waiting to reach the porch, the question already formed, already carrying the assumption that something had been set in motion. I told the truth, I said. That's not what I asked, she replied. It's the answer, I said. Caleb's truck appeared at the end of the street, slowing as it approached, then turning into the driveway with a motion that felt less certain than usual, the alignment slightly off before he corrected it. They were all there now, not arranged, not coordinated, just present. Nora's words echoed quietly in the back of my mind. Then we proceed. I filed a formal notice, I said, looking at all three of them now. With documentation. Silence. The kind that does not ask for clarification because it already understands. Martin exhaled slowly, his shoulders shifting. You're going to regret this, he said. There was that sentence again. I felt it pass through me without finding anything to hold on to. No, I said. I think this is the part where you do. Marissa's face tightened, her jaw setting in a way that mirrored his, though she would not recognize that if it were pointed out to her. You didn't have to escalate this, she said. You already did, I replied. Caleb stood by the truck, his hands at his sides, his posture uncertain in a way that did not fit him, the usual confidence replaced by something less stable. This is going to get messy, he said. It already was, I said. You just didn't think I would see it. The words hung there, familiar now, but carrying a different weight in this context. No longer just an observation, but a line drawn. No one moved for a moment. Then slowly, almost without deciding to, I stepped past them, up onto the porch and into the house. I did not look back. Inside, the air felt the same as it had that morning, the quiet intact, the refrigerator humming, the clock marking time without interruption. I set my purse on the table, took out the notebook, and opened it to a new page. Date, time, filed. I wrote it once. Then I added another line beneath it, the pen moving steadily, the letters forming without hesitation. This is no longer something they can undo. I closed the notebook and placed it beside the mug, the crack along the rim catching the light just enough to remind me that things do not need to be perfect to hold. Outside, voices began again. Inside, I did not listen. Because for the first time since this began, the story was no longer only in my hands. It was in the system, and the system does not forget. By Tuesday afternoon, the house had begun to sound different, and I do not mean quieter or louder, but altered in a way that made even ordinary movements feel like they belonged to a version of the place that had shifted slightly out of alignment. Martin moved through rooms without announcing himself, not calling out from the hallway the way he used to, not asking where I was, not narrating his presence as if the space needed to acknowledge him to make it real. He opened cabinets and closed them again with more care than necessary, the soft click of wood against wood replacing the careless thud that had always irritated me more than I ever admitted. He did not mention the filing. That, more than anything, told me how seriously he had begun to take it. People who think something is small argue about it. People who understand it is not stop using it as a subject and begin treating it as a condition. Marissa called at 2:17, her name appearing on my phone while I was standing at the ironing board pressing a seam that had already been pressed once, but needed it again because the fabric was stubborn in a way I understood. I let it ring twice before answering, not to make a point, but because I needed to place the iron upright, unplug it, and wipe my hands on the cloth before picking up something that was about to carry more weight than the device itself suggested. "Mom," she said, and this time there was no softness in it, no attempt to arrange the word into something gentle. "We need to talk." "We've been talking," I said. "This is different." I leaned the iron against the board, watching the small curl of steam dissipate into the air. "How?" "They contacted me," she said. There it was. Not what happened. Who knew? "Who?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "The attorney," she said. "Nora Finch. She left a message at my office." "Good," I said. A pause. "You didn't have to go that far," Marissa continued, and now there was something under the frustration. Not quite fear, but the beginning of it, the recognition that something had moved beyond the edges she had been managing. "I went exactly as far as you did," I said. "That's not the same," she snapped, the control slipping for a moment. "We're family." "Yes," I replied. "You said that before you sent paperwork to a bank with my name on it." Silence. Not the kind that looks for a way out, but the kind that realizes there may not be one, that does not leave something behind. "What do you want?" she asked finally. It was the second time that question had been asked in 2 days, and it sounded different now, less like a negotiation, more like a search for a boundary that had already been drawn. "I want this handled properly," I said. "At my office?" she asked. "No," I replied, "through mine." She let out a breath that carried more than just air. "You're going to make this public." "I'm going to make it documented," I said. "What happens after that depends on what you do next." Another pause, longer this time, the sound of her shifting the phone from one ear to the other faintly audible, the small background noise of an office moving around her, People talking, a printer running, life continuing in a place that had just been introduced to something it did not expect. "Dad didn't mean it the way you think," she said, and I could hear her reaching for something familiar, a sentence she had used before in other contexts, smoothing over things that did not need smoothing until they did. "I don't need to think about it," I said. "I saw it." "You saw a moment," she insisted, "not the whole situation." I looked down at the seam I had been pressing, running my finger along the line where the fabric met, feeling for any unevenness. "I saw enough," I said. She did not argue with that. Not because she agreed, but because she understood the futility of trying to reshape something that had already been captured in a form that did not require interpretation. "We can fix this," she said after a moment. And there it was again. Not denial, not deflection, but negotiation. "We can withdraw everything. We can put something in writing that protects you without all of this." "All of this," I repeated. "Yes," she said, her voice softer now, careful again. "The filing, the report, the attention." "The attention came when you tried to take control of my account," I said. "This is just where it goes next." She did not respond immediately, and in that silence I could almost hear the calculations, the shifting of options, the recognition that the path she had been on had narrowed without her noticing. "What if we come over tonight?" she said. "Just you and me. We sit down and talk through it. No Dad, no Caleb, just us." For a moment I considered it. Not because I believed it would change anything, but because there was a part of me that remembered sitting across from her at this same table years ago, explaining things, listening, finding ways to meet somewhere in the middle. That part of me has not disappeared. It is simply learned when it is being asked to show up for something that no longer exists. "I'll be here," I said. That was as close to an agreement as I was willing to give. She arrived at 6:08, alone, her car pulling into the driveway with less precision than usual, the alignment slightly off before she corrected it, the small adjustments of someone whose attention is not fully on the task in front of her. Martin was not home. That had been arranged without being discussed. She came in through the front door, not the side, and she did not carry a folder this time, which was the first sign that this was not a continuation of the same approach. She stood in the living room for a moment, looking at the space as if she were seeing it differently. The furniture, the light, the small things that have always been there, now carrying a different context. "Can we sit?" she asked. We sat at the table. Of course we did. There are places in a house where certain conversations always happen, not because they have to, but because they have before, and the room remembers. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. She looked at her hands, then at me, then back at the table. "I didn't think it would go this way," she said. "I know," I replied. She looked up quickly, surprised. "You said that," I continued. "Yesterday, Caleb said it too, in a different way." She let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "He always says things like that when he's nervous." "Yes," I said. "And you always notice," she added. "Yes." Another pause. "I should have talked to you first," she said, and this time the sentence landed differently, not as a strategy, but as something closer to acknowledgement. "Yes," I said. "I thought if we just handled it, it would be easier," she continued, her words slower now, less arranged. "For everyone." "For everyone," I repeated. She nodded. "You've been doing so much, and Dad keeps saying you're tired, that you're not seeing how things are adding up, and I believed him." I watched her as she said it, the way her eyes moved slightly to the side, not avoiding mine, but not fully holding them either, the way people look when they are trying to say something true without admitting how long they have known it. "You didn't ask me," I said. "No," she admitted. "You didn't check." "No." "You decided." She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Yes." There it was, not an explanation, not a defense, just a sequence of choices, laid out in order. For a moment, the room felt smaller. Not physically, but in the way that happens when something large has been reduced to its simplest form. "I can call Nora," she said then, the shift subtle but clear. "I can explain. I can tell her it was a misunderstanding." "No," I said. She frowned. "Why not?" "Because it wasn't." She sat back slightly, her shoulders dropping a fraction. "This is going to follow us," she said. "At work, with the firm, with everything." "Yes," I said. "You're okay with that?" I looked at her. "I'm okay with what I did," I replied. "You need to decide if you are." She held my gaze then, longer than she had all afternoon, and for a moment there was something there that felt like the beginning of understanding. Not agreement, not forgiveness, but the recognition that the situation was no longer something she could rearrange into a version that felt better. "Dad's not going to let this go," she said quietly. "No," I said. "He isn't." "And Caleb will decide what he does next," I finished. She nodded slowly. "And you?" she asked. "I already did," I said. The words settled between us, not heavy, not light, just present, the way truth tends to be when it has finally been allowed to sit where it belongs. We sat there for a while after that, not speaking, the quiet no longer strained, but not comfortable either, something in between, something that did not require immediate resolution. When she stood to leave, she hesitated at the doorway. "I didn't think it would matter," she said again, softer this time, as if repeating it might change its meaning. "It does," I said. She nodded once, then stepped out into the evening, the door closing behind her with a sound that felt final without needing to be. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the handle, feeling the solidness of it, the certainty of a boundary that had been tested and had held. In the kitchen, the mug was still on the table, the coffee long gone cold, the thin line along the rim catching the last of the light. I picked it up, carried it to the sink and rinsed it out, watching the water run clear over the ceramic, the small crack holding as it always had. Some things break, some things hold, and some things, once seen clearly, never return to what they were before. The first official letter arrived on Thursday, in an envelope so ordinary that I almost missed it between the grocery coupons and a postcard from a dentist's office I had not visited in 9 years. That is one thing no one tells you about consequences. They do not always arrive with sirens or raised voices or someone standing dramatically in a doorway. Sometimes they arrive folded in thirds, printed in black ink, delivered by a mail carrier who is thinking about lunch. I stood at the kitchen counter with the envelope in my hand and looked at the return address before opening it. Nora Finch's office. The paper inside was heavy enough to feel expensive, but not so heavy that it looked like anyone was trying to impress you. A formal confirmation. Notice received. Bank notified. Trust account secured. No external management authority recognized without verified in-person consent. Whitcomb Family Holdings placed under review pending additional documentation. I read it twice, not because I did not understand it, because some sentences are worth watching settle. Martin was in the den when I opened it. I could hear the television, not loud enough to follow, just the low, uneven murmur of men discussing something they had no control over, which felt appropriate. He had been home more often since the filing, though he moved through the house as if he were visiting a place where someone else knew the rules. He stopped leaving his jacket over the kitchen chair. He rinsed his mug now, not well, but enough that I noticed the effort, which annoyed me more than if he had not done it at all. There are small courtesies that come too late and feel less like respect than strategy. I folded the letter along its original creases and placed it in the blue folder I had started using for this, not the old notebook, not the household records, but a new folder, because some things deserve their own container. The label on the tab was blank. I had not written anything on it yet. I knew what it was, and for the moment, that was enough. At 11:26, Marissa called. I did not answer. She called again at 11:31. I did not answer that one either. At 11:42, a text came through. "Mom, please call me. This is affecting my work." I looked at the sentence for a long time, not because it surprised me, but because it was such a clean little window into the shape of the problem. This. Not what I did, not what we tried, not the forged signature. This. The consequence had become the offense because it had finally reached her desk. I set the phone face down on the counter and went back to folding laundry. There is a kind of peace in folding towels when your life is trying to become dramatic around you. Corners matched, edges smoothed, stack one, stack two. The old white towel with the frayed side for cleaning, the blue towel for the downstairs bath. The yellow one I never liked but keep because June gave it to me and she would notice if it disappeared. Ordinary categories, manageable outcomes. You fold what is in front of you, you put it where it belongs. Caleb came by just after 2. I saw his truck before I heard it, because the kitchen window faces the driveway, and the sunlight caught the windshield as he turned in too fast and corrected too late. The tires rolling over the edge of the grass where Martin always told him not to drive. He sat in the truck for almost a full minute after cutting the engine. Hands on the wheel, head tilted forward, and for a moment I saw him as a boy again. Sitting in the car after baseball practice, refusing to come inside because he had struck out twice and believed embarrassment was something that could be waited out. He knocked this time. That mattered. I opened the door and did not step aside immediately. He looked tired in a way I had not seen before. Not sleepy, not overworked, but depleted. The kind of tired that comes when a person has spent too many hours inside their own justifications and found them thinner than expected. "Can I come in?" he asked. I moved back. He entered without his usual confidence, wiping his shoes on the mat even though they were not dirty. He stood in the hall for a moment, looking toward the kitchen, toward the stairs, toward the closed workroom door. His eyes paused there. "We need to talk," he said. "You and Marissa both like that sentence." He looked down, almost smiled, then didn't. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table, always the same table. If that wood could speak, it would not need to raise its voice. Caleb rubbed his hands together once, then placed them flat in front of him. His nails were short, uneven, one cuticle torn raw near the thumb. I noticed because I had spent too many years noticing signs of stress in people who were about to ask me for something. "Nora's office contacted my attorney," he said. "You have an attorney?" Marissa said I should. Of course she did. He told me the video changes things. It does. He said the bank document changes things. It does. He looked at me then, and for the first time since this began, there was no performance in his face. No practiced confidence. No son speaking to a mother he expected to absorb the blow for him. Just a man sitting across from the person whose name he had written without permission. "I didn't think of it like forgery," he said. I let that sentence sit, not because it deserved mercy, because it deserved accuracy. "What did you think it was?" I asked. He swallowed. "Helping Dad." "No." His face tightened. "You were helping yourself feel less responsible," I said. "That's different." He looked away. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the street, the sound rising and falling as it turned corners around a yard I could not see. The ordinary world again, refusing to pause. "Dad said you'd never agree," Caleb said. He was right. He said you were being stubborn. I was. That made him look back at me. I was stubborn about my own money, I said. My own trust, my own signature. There are worse things to be stubborn about. He nodded once, a small movement, more reflex than agreement. "I could lose Sophie over this," he said. There it was. Not I hurt you, not I broke the law. What it might cost him. I felt the old mother in me move, the instinctive part that hears fear in your child's voice and reaches before thinking. It is an ancient reflex. It does not care how old the child is or what he has done. It only knows that once his whole hand fit around one of your fingers, and you believed keeping him safe was the same thing as raising him right. But the woman sitting at that table was not only his mother anymore. She was also the person whose name he had signed. "Sophie asked you why," I said. His face changed. "She shouldn't have had to." "I know. You put her in that room. I didn't know she'd... See it? I finished. He closed his mouth. I leaned back slightly, feeling the chair press against my shoulders. That's the thing, Caleb. You weren't sorry when you thought no one saw it. He looked down at his hands. That's not fair, he said, but quietly, without force. It's accurate. The lawnmower stopped. The sudden absence of it made the kitchen feel larger. He sat there for a while, and I let him. People think confrontation is made of words, but sometimes it is made of not rescuing someone from the silence after they run out of them. Finally, he said, "What happens now?" "That depends on you." He looked up. "You tell the truth," I said. "To your attorney. To Nora if asked. To Sophie if she asks. You stop saying this was help. You stop saying it was family. You stop using softer words for hard things." He rubbed his thumb over the torn skin near his nail. "And if I do? That does not erase what you did." "I know." "Do you?" He did not answer. That was the first honest thing he gave me. When he left, he stood at the door for a moment like he wanted to hug me and knew better than to try. I appreciated that more than I expected. Martin came out of the den after Caleb's truck pulled away. He had been listening. Not close enough to hear everything, maybe, but close enough to know the shape of it. "You're turning them against me," he said. I was still standing in the hall, one hand on the doorknob, the brass warm from the afternoon sun. "No," I said. "You're hearing them without me translating." He did not like that. His face hardened, the softness he had been practicing all week disappearing all at once. "You think you're winning," he said. I turned fully toward him. "I think you still don't understand what this is." "What is it, Eleanor?" "A correction." The word stopped him. Not because it was loud, because it was plain. He stared at me for a moment, and I could see him trying to decide whether to argue, threaten, retreat, or charm. I had watched him make that calculation in rooms full of strangers. I had watched people mistake it for confidence. It looked different when you knew what it was. It looked like fear selecting a costume. Marissa texted again before dinner. This could ruin my license. I typed 3 words, deleted them, typed nothing, and set the phone down. Some messages do not need replies. Some consequences answer themselves. That evening, I ate alone at the kitchen table while Martin stayed in the den, pretending not to. I made soup from what was left in the refrigerator. Carrots slightly soft at the ends, celery that had begun to bend, half an onion wrapped in plastic and forgotten behind a jar of pickles. It was not a beautiful meal. It was good enough. There is a difference, and at 68, I have learned to respect it. After dinner, I opened the blue folder again and added the letter from Nora, Caleb's visit, Marissa's texts, and one more page from my notebook. By then, the consequences had become visible. Marissa's office knew. Caleb's attorney knew. The bank knew. The registered agent knew. Martin knew that people outside this house now had copies of what he had tried to keep inside it. That is the part people like him never understand about control. It works only as long as the room stays small. Once the door opens, it is not control anymore. It is evidence leaving the house. The last thing I expected was quiet, but that is what came. Not all at once, not as a clean break from what had been, but gradually, the way a room settles after people have left it, chairs slightly out of place, the air still holding the shape of conversations that will not continue. By Friday morning, the house felt like it belonged to me again. Not because Martin had left, though he had started spending more nights elsewhere without announcing it, but because the tension that had been moving through the rooms like an unseen draft had finally found a way out. The refrigerator hummed without interruption. The clock in the hallway ticked without being noticed. The workroom door stayed open, the light falling across the table in that familiar angle that made the surface look longer than it was. I made coffee the same way I always had, the same measured scoop, the same careful pour, the same mug with a thin crack that had never spread beyond what it could hold. I stood at the counter and drank it slowly, not because I was savoring it, but because I no longer felt the need to rush through ordinary things to make space for something else. Nora called at 9:14. "Updates," she said, her voice as even as it had been from the beginning. I leaned against the counter, the phone tucked between my shoulder and ear, my hands free, the way I prefer to take calls that matter. Marissa's firm has opened an internal review, she continued. Nothing public yet, but it's contained. Her license is under scrutiny pending outcome. I closed my eyes for a moment, not in relief, not in regret, just acknowledging the movement of something that had been set in motion days ago and was now continuing on its own. Caleb's attorney contacted us, Nora added. He's cooperating, that helps him. Yes, I said. And Martin, she paused, just slightly, enough to mark the shift in subject, has retained counsel. He's contesting the characterization. Of course he was. How? I asked. He's arguing intent, she said. That it was administrative, not exploitative. I let out a small breath. Intent is already documented, I said. It is, she agreed. Which is why this won't go the way he wants it to. There was a brief silence, not empty, just complete. You've done everything correctly, Nora said then, not as praise but as a statement of fact. I know, I replied. When I hung up, I stood there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, the kitchen exactly as it had been before the call and yet not the same. There is a difference between knowing something is happening and hearing it confirmed in language that carries weight outside your own understanding. By midday, the house was quiet enough that I could hear the small sounds I had not noticed in weeks. The creak of the third step when I went upstairs, the soft click of the light switch in the hallway, the faint rustle of fabric when I moved through the workroom. I opened the cabinet and took out the old tin box I keep my thread in, the one that still smells faintly of cedar and thyme, and I sat at the table with a piece of fabric that had been waiting for me to finish it long before any of this began. A simple hem, nothing complicated, just a line that needed to be made straight. As I worked, I thought about all the lines that had been crossed and all the ones that had been redrawn, not in anger, not in retaliation, but in clarity. There is a difference between those things, though people often confuse them because they arrive at the same place. Marissa came by that afternoon. She did not call first. She knocked once, then again, more softly, as if the second knock were the one that mattered. I opened the door. She stood there without a folder, without a phone in her hand, without anything to place between us. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. She walked into the kitchen and stopped, looking at the table, the counter, the small things that had not changed and yet carried the weight of everything that had. "They've started asking questions," she said. "I know." I told them the truth, she added, and her voice did not waver, which told me she was not rehearsing it. "Good," I said. She nodded, once, then looked at me in a way she had not since this began, not as someone managing a situation, not as someone arranging outcomes, but as someone standing in the result of her own decisions. "I didn't understand what it meant," she said. "Yes, you did," I replied. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, the argument dissolving before it could form. "I didn't think it would go this far," she tried instead. "No," I said. "You didn't." We stood there for a moment, the space between us not empty, but no longer filled with the same kind of tension. Something had shifted, not resolved, not repaired, but moved into a different place. "I can't fix this," she said quietly. "No," I said, "you can't." "And you won't," she stopped, searching for the right word. "You won't stop it." "No," I said. She nodded, slowly, the motion of someone aligning herself with a reality she would have preferred to avoid. "I'm sorry," she said then, and this time the words landed without decoration, without strategy, without expectation. I let them sit. "Thank you," I said. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, just acknowledgement. She stayed for a few minutes more, not talking much, not asking for anything, just present in a way she had not been for a long time. And then she left, the door closing behind her with that same quiet finality. Caleb did not come back, but he called. "Mom," he said, his voice different now, less certain, more careful. "I told them everything." "I know." I'm trying to make it right. I thought about that. There isn't a version of this where it becomes right, I said. There are only versions where you stop making it worse. He was quiet for a moment. I understand, he said. I believed him, not completely, but enough. Martin did not call. He sent a message instead. We need to talk. This has gone too far. I read it once and set the phone down. Some conversations no longer need to happen in private. That evening, I sat in the workroom with the window open, the air moving slowly through the space, carrying the faint sound of someone walking a dog down the street, the small rhythm of steps and leash and breath that belongs to a life that continues whether you are part of it or not. I took out the notebook. Date, Friday, Nora update, Marissa visit, Caleb call. I wrote each line carefully, not because I needed the record anymore, but because I wanted to complete it. Then I added one final line at the bottom of the page. It was never about the money. I looked at that sentence for a long time, the words simple, almost obvious, but holding everything that had happened inside them. It was about control. It was about assumption. It was about the quiet belief that I would not see, would not question, would not stop them. I closed the notebook and set it beside the blue folder, both of them resting on the table where so many things had begun and ended. The house was quiet again. Not empty, not lonely, just quiet. I stood and walked to the kitchen, rinsed the mug, set it on the rack, and turned off the light. As I moved through the hallway, the clock continued its steady count, the refrigerator hummed, the floorboards shifted slightly under my weight, all the small confirmations that the world, at least this small part of it, was exactly where it needed to be. At the door, I paused, my hand on the handle, the brass cool now under my fingers. There is a moment at the end of something like this where you expect a feeling to arrive, something definitive, something that tells you what it all meant, what you gained, what you lost. Nothing like that came, just a quiet understanding. I opened the door, stepped out onto the porch, and looked at the street it had always been, the same houses, the same light, the same slow movement of evening settling in. Some things break, some things hold, and some things, once seen clearly, leave you exactly where you are, but no longer the same person standing there.